He had become a zombie during the apocalypse, a completely normal zombie. To increase his chances of survival, he decided he would become even stronger, attaining a body that he never could have had while alive. And with that, he ended up becoming the king of all the undead. His next step now is dealing with humanity. The train with several cars moves along its path calmly. Many people are crossing the tracks as if they don't know that a collision with a locomotive is fatal. The desperate train conductor tries to warn the fools to get out of the way as he has lost control of the train. Finally, the oblivious ones realize that the enormous locomotive is out of control. Desperate to survive, people start running, but the wheel of a stroller gets stuck. A mother with a baby in her arms, unwilling to abandon the stroller, refuses to pick up her child, unwilling to lose something that is practically worthless. The others try to warn her that her time is running out, while another woman closes her eyes, unable to watch the impending tragedy. In mere moments, that woman would have been reduced to a mass of human paste. Her luck was that a mysterious hooded figure was among the crowd. In the blink of an eye, everything blurred. Instead of saving the woman, the protagonist thought it would be easier to destroy the locomotive, stopping it forcefully. The train cars derailed with the potential to cause an even greater catastrophe. However, the woman and her child were alive, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Standing before her was that mysterious man, his face obscured from view. Turning to the woman, the protagonist asked if she was all right. Still in shock, the woman was deeply grateful for being saved. But her gratitude quickly gave way to an expression of pure terror. Even the infant in her arms was petrified. That being, he definitely looked just like a zombie. The woman's desperate scream echoed through the air. The protagonist's name is Zombie. His name is quite literally what defines him, a zombie. He had just woken up and was getting out of bed, unsure of his own existence or when he had even become such a creature. Despite everything, he had a dream, just like any other person. He wished to befriend humans so that discrimination would end. With that goal in mind, he had been working tirelessly every day, believing that one day, after much effort, he would achieve it. His confidence was unwavering, and he truly believed in his dream. While brushing his teeth, he lost another one because, after all, he was a zombie. In pursuit of his dream, he had lost count of how many people he had helped. A plane out of control was on a collision course with a stadium packed with people. The audience panicked, scrambling to evacuate, creating chaos and mayhem, until a small child pointed out the unthinkable. The plane had not crashed as expected. That massive object had been stopped by a single being, leaving the entire crowd in stunned silence. The building was engulfed in flames, fire raging out of control as a woman screamed that her children were still inside. To the utter shock of the firefighters, a zombie emerged from the building carrying 5 children. He wasn't that strong, or at least, not as he remembered being in life. It all started with his zombie pandemic. This was the beginning of the apocalypse. At the time, he was still a student. Everything happened so fast that he had no chance to escape. This led to him becoming a completely normal zombie, just like all the others. He was just another one following the crowd and moving only as directed by the greater mass. One fateful day, armed humans appeared, pointing their weapons at all of them. Zombies were exterminated in large numbers, treated like pests. Their bodies were burned and used as fuel, while the survivors became the engines of infinite energy mechanisms. Zombies had become a source of electricity for humanity, yet the protagonist did not understand why humans hated zombies or why zombies craved human flesh. To survive, he decided to change his behavior and began training rigorously. He lifted weights, ran, swam, and jumped every single day without fail. An independent life begins through one's own effort, and he did not feed on meat. His meals consisted of whey protein, which he consumed 3 times a day. Even though his exhaustion was immense, he continued training late into the night, until one day he had finally become truly strong. He had become practically invincible with an aesthetic yet monstrously powerful body. After gaining strength and knowledge, he decided to approach the nearest human city. He tried to make them see zombies in a different light. His desire was to live under human laws, to be a good zombie. Inside his home, he continued his daily chores, realizing that his food supplies had run out. With that, it was time to go to the market to restock. It was a beautiful day outside. The sky was clear and bright. The protagonist went to the market he usually frequented to replenish his supplies. The clerk who attended to him asked if it wasn't uncomfortable to wear that mask all the time. The protagonist replied that, contrary to what she thought, it was actually quite comfortable. The employees went to the truck to load his purchased goods. A suspicious glint outside revealed that the protagonist was being watched. Some journalists wanted to confirm if it was really him. They wanted to see what was beneath that mask. They were doing their best to gather any clues about the zombie's identity. Holding a flyer in his hand, he noticed that one of his friends was being sought again. That was Goo, who had probably done something to anger humanity once more. The cameraman wondered if this person was really the same one who had stopped an airplane with his bare hands, while his boss admitted that they could be mistaken. Maybe it had all been a media exaggeration. That's why they needed to uncover the identity behind this masked figure. However, they ended up witnessing something so absurd that it completely robbed them of their ability to speak. The citizen they had been observing had just lifted that truck with his bare hands. The protagonist patiently looked up, as if calculating a trajectory. The ground beneath his feet began to crack completely. Suddenly, the truck vanished because it was now several meters high in the air. It was such an unbelievable sight that the journalists couldn't comprehend what had just happened. And in fact, it was such a powerful jump that the protagonist had managed to reach orbit. Far from there, a heavily guarded fence stood, with clear warnings that passage was strictly forbidden. On the other side of the fence, several erratic zombies wandered aimlessly. In their own language, a child told its mother that it was hungry. The mother told the little one to hold on just a little longer. Apparently, zombies were capable of reproduction. Don't ask how. Illuminated by the moonlight, the powerful zombie crashed into the middle of the devastated city. On his back was a truck completely filled with supplies. The vehicle was carefully placed on the ground. This brought joy to the zombies, who realized that their king had returned. A child asked why he didn't simply drive the truck like humans do. Unfortunately, he didn't have a driver's license, so he had to do things this way. This was a city he had conquered himself, far away from human villages, where zombies fed on eggs to avoid attacking people. Turning to the child, he asked where Goo and the others were. The little one said they were all in the hotel hall. The protagonist headed to the place to meet with these creatures. Everyone present was of an extremely high threat level. The mere gathering of such powerful beings was a calamity in itself. Even more absurd was the fact that they all greeted the protagonist as their supreme majesty. Handing the flyer to one of his subordinates, he informed them that Goo was once again being hunted by the humans. The powerful creature apologized, saying he always lost control whenever he saw a human. The protagonist walked over to a sofa and took a seat. One of his subordinates reported that their numbers were growing, but to stay hidden from humans, they had already relocated several times. The most reckless among them wanted to start a massacre. He was eager to use his chainsaw as soon as possible. After hearing this, the protagonist warned that humans could be terrifying as well. They were soon interrupted by a strange sound echoing through the sky above the city. The noise came from an aircraft approaching at high speed. Inside was a woman with two exceptionally well-raised twins. One could see their health and good upbringing just by looking at them. The woman stood inside the aircraft, radiating confidence, as if she were the true protagonist of this story. She seemed to be analyzing data on a massive screen, reviewing details of the current mission. Her staff assured the president that everything was in order, clear and stable, with no signs of interference. The equipment was ready for deployment. The payload had also been checked, a nuclear weapon programmed to detonate 20 minutes after activation. The protagonist noticed the unusual approach of the humans. High above, inside the aircraft, the powerful president crossed her arms, holding her twins close. She could hardly wait for the zombies to experience the devastating power of her nuclear weapon. She hated them all. As the aircraft drew closer, the sound of its engines became more deafening. One of the creatures alerted the others that humans were responsible for the noise. He wanted his leader's permission to eliminate them all, but the protagonist ordered that the priority was evacuating the citizens. His subordinate had to restrain himself. He lost control far too easily. Faced with this crisis, the responsibility of handling everything fell upon him. Inside the aircraft, the president attempted to communicate with the ground team. She informed the soldiers that they had 20 minutes to rescue any remaining civilians and evacuate the area. Repeating the order, the squad confirmed that they understood. At one of the aircraft's exits stood Marshall, one of humanity's greatest heroes, responsible for intercepting any powerful zombie that might appear. Clad in an impressive suit of armor and wielding a formidable sword, he patiently awaited the action. He assured the president that she could leave everything to him. If any strong zombies showed up, he would slice it down without hesitation. On the ground, the massive creatures did everything they could to continue fleeing. Elsewhere, they were being watched by a mysterious man with long hair. A bizarre-looking boy informed his superior, Faye, that the people from the Extraordinary Academy had found their zombies. A wonderful situation, because now they would get to play with these people. Pressing a button, a cage appeared filled with imprisoned humans. They were released in the middle of the zombie horde. The ground team detected human life signals and began preparing to move to that location. Properly positioned with their machine guns, they opened fire. Against safety protocol, a girl had removed her protective helmet, irritated that the zombie refused to die. The poor zombie boy shut his eyes in terror, convinced he was about to be killed once again. But standing in front of him was the great protagonist, whose sheer power was so overwhelming that even regular clothes became bulletproof just by being worn by him. A more determined soldier, unwilling to believe in the existence of invulnerable zombies, decided it was time to let his bazooka sing the song of his people. He unleashed a devastating blast of firepower against the creature. A massive explosion erupted exactly as the soldiers expected, and soon thick smoke filled the air. A soldier approached his superior, suggesting that perhaps this was no ordinary zombie, but an extraordinary individual known for saving people. He was famous for always wearing an incredibly realistic mask that made him look like a zombie. Now the soldier was completely terrified, realizing he might have attacked the wrong person. As the smoke cleared, the protagonist emerged completely unharmed by everything that had transpired so far. Inside the aircraft, the president continued analyzing the conflict data. She informed Marshall that a powerful zombie had appeared in the combat zone. The warrior immediately requested to handle the situation personally. Without any protective gear, he launched himself from the aircraft, diving straight into the battle. Meanwhile, in another location, those mysterious figures continued observing the events. They noted that nearly all the people had already been saved. Perhaps they had underestimated their opponents. The long-haired man then declared that it was time to make things more interesting. Immediately, the rat-faced young man understood exactly what they were about to do. Amidst the horde of zombies, they activated something that began altering one of them. Its eyes changed, and one of its arms started growing uncontrollably. What had once been a completely ordinary zombie had transformed into a gigantic and dangerous monstrosity. The protagonist was still there, protecting his friends when he saw the monstrous transformation. While the creature roared wildly, the armored human rushed toward the battlefield. The ground squad received an alert about the emergence of a boss-level zombie. With that information, they immediately mobilized toward the new threat. To everyone's surprise, the squad leader immediately began to retreat without a second thought. However, his actions were soon understood correctly, still filled with remorse. If the goal was to save the life of that extraordinary person, then he had no choice. With the protagonist in his arms, he moved further and further away from the center of danger. He placed him inside the evacuation vehicle. Once inside the armored transporter, he ordered the driver to speed up immediately. They had lives to save. It didn't take long for the vehicle to speed off, tires screeching. Inside the military truck, the girl expressed her curiosity about the identity of this person, especially why he always wore that same mask. Questioned so directly, the protagonist didn't know how to respond. At the heart of the battle, the ground troops were stunned. The monstrous zombie had just lifted an entire bus. Its strength was so overwhelming that it hurled the vehicle at the soldiers as if it were made of paper. Before disaster could strike, the samurai warrior arrived on the battlefield. With a single swing of his blade, he sliced the bus cleanly in two. The wreckage hit the ground, revealing how precise the cut had been. The soldiers cheered. If the samurai from the academy was here, victory was certain. Approaching the creature, the samurai ordered the soldiers to continue the evacuation. The monster was now his responsibility. Civilians were being evacuated little by little. The squad leader was informed that the dangerous zombie had already been intercepted. Among the humans, the protagonist recognized a voice that felt strangely familiar. The girl reassured him, saying not to worry, they were there to help. That's when he noticed something strange. The masked human they had fought so hard to save had disappeared. Marshall turned to the creature before him and asked if it felt any pain. The zombie roared in pure rage, completely uncontrolled. It was obvious that it had no command over its own actions. Like a wild beast, it lunged at the samurai. The warrior prepared to draw his sword. Faster than the eye could see, the samurai moved past the creature, his blade already sheathed. He had delivered countless cuts in an instant, determined to end its suffering. It all happened too fast. Marshall had executed the battle flawlessly. The zombie's body began showing signs of being sliced beyond its limits. It collapsed, torn apart, lifeless. Marshall slowly wiped his blade, convinced that his job was done. Looking at the remains on the ground, he wished the poor creature could finally rest in peace. But then faint footsteps caught his attention. Someone else was there. Seeing the unknown figure approach the fallen creature, he wondered if this was another zombie. The protagonist gazed at his former companion, grief evident in his eyes as if mourning a loss. Inside the support aircraft, the rest of the team received confirmation that the zombie had been completely eliminated. The president congratulated Marshall on his achievement, suggesting they record the event as part of his legacy. The protagonist apologized for what had happened. Not all of them were capable of controlling themselves. Hearing the mysterious figure speak in the plural, Marshall immediately assumed he was a zombie as well. Without a shred of hesitation, he had already unleashed his first strike against the protagonist. At that moment, the support team detected the emergence of yet another boss-level zombie. The young officer shrugged it off, saying there was no need to worry. Just give Marshall the order and he would finish the job. But the girl was already terrified. The samurai's signal had completely vanished. It had happened so quickly that even the president grew apprehensive about what might have occurred. Marshall's face was wounded as if he had been struck. His body was now hanging from the top of a streetlight and the armor he once wore was gone. His life signals were faint. He had suffered severe damage. The situation was becoming dire for the humans as the evacuation had not yet been completed. Looking at the unfolding crisis, the president grew deeply and genuinely enraged. Someone needed to take action to prevent the worst from happening. Shocking her entire team, she descended from the aircraft, heading straight into the battle. Her team, alarmed, called out that she was being reckless. She couldn't just go down there all alone. She was already preparing her first strike, determined to assess the strength of this creature for herself. The protagonist was caught off guard. He hadn't expected another human to appear so quickly. The president, however, was even more astonished. Her blade had shattered as if it were made of glass. She took a moment to process what had happened, while the protagonist barely felt anything more than a slight poke on his head. Now she was truly frightened, struggling to comprehend what kind of creature could be as hard as steel. Realizing he was far stronger than she had initially assumed, she began putting distance between them. Her team warned her that, due to the sheer force of her initial strike, they couldn't deploy reinforcements to assist her. Sheathing what remained of her broken blade, the president reassured them that she was fine. Seizing this brief window of opportunity, the protagonist tried to apologize, saying he had already done so with the samurai. She was stunned by his ability to speak, recognizing that this creature had to be some kind of mutant. This only made her draw an even more powerful weapon. With her enchanted blade in hand, the president prepared for another devastating attack. The protagonist grew desperate. He didn't want to fight and wished she would just listen. Brimming with aggression, the president declared that he could speak to the edge of her sword. Her first attack failed, he dodged it with ease, but that did not put an end to the battle. She had already repositioned herself, now she was behind him. He turned to find her poised to strike once more. Executing one of her signature moves, the president unleashed a sweeping slash. Everything around her was sliced cleanly by her blade, but the protagonist managed to evade the attack in true Matrix style. The strike was so powerful that even the surrounding buildings were severely damaged. Everything was happening too fast, and the protagonist was genuinely impressed by her combat ability. However, the president was growing increasingly infuriated, assuming that the creature was merely toying with her. Nearby, soldiers were retrieving the injured samurai. His brutal beating had been so severe that he could barely speak. Finally, the president received word that the evacuation had been successfully completed. Now she, too, could retreat. Deeply focused on the heat of battle, one of her assistants urgently asked if she had heard the order. But by then, she and the protagonist were already dashing through the abandoned city, moving like two ninjas. The protagonist did everything he could to get away from the furious woman. Meanwhile, the president grew even more enraged, realizing that the creature had no intention of engaging in combat. He pointed out that if he didn't try to run, she would never stop trying to cut him down. With just a few leaps, the protagonist managed to create an efficient distance between them. This only fueled her fury even further. This time, she was determined to show him the second extension of her techniques. At that moment, her legs revealed themselves to be prosthetic and steam began to escape from her body. Now fully powered, the president covered a massive distance with a single leap. The protagonist, who had thought he was escaping comfortably, was suddenly caught off guard by the president's reappearance. With rage overflowing in her eyes, she launched another devastating attack. She landed hard on the ground after executing her strike. Moments later, the protagonist also crashed down, hitting the ground like a sack of potatoes. Believing her target to be completely eliminated, the president sheathed her sword. She then ordered the aircraft to begin lowering altitude so they could retrieve him. The most disappointed person with this outcome was the rat-faced man. After all, every single citizen had been evacuated safely. But the story was far from over, as they still had a spy within the organization. The rescued civilians were celebrating, relieved to have been saved successfully. Inside the cockpit, the pilot suddenly heard something suspicious. Turning to the side, he was met with a disturbing sight. Someone had pressed a button that posed extreme danger to them all. The nuclear warhead inside the aircraft had been launched. Now it was falling, headed directly toward the survivors. Unaware of this, the civilians continued celebrating, assuming the mission was over. The pilot quickly informed the crew that they shouldn't be celebrating. There was a spy among them, and the warhead had been deployed. Hearing these grim words, the crew was left in complete shock. The rescued civilians were now overtaken by absolute terror. It was time to inform the president there was a traitor among them, and she needed to escape immediately. Unfortunately, she was paralyzed by the sheer horror of the situation. The nuclear bomb was descending toward the city, and nothing could stop it now. They were taking the necessary measures to minimize the damage, as extracting the president was now a top priority. She tried using her prosthetic enhancements, but immediately realized something was terribly wrong. Time was running out, and fast. The president was still outside the aircraft. At that moment, she struggled to activate the acceleration of her prosthetics. She had completely drained their battery while fighting a mutant she had failed to defeat. Apparently, she had forgotten to change the power cells in her prosthetics before heading into battle, a truly regrettable mistake. Still distracted by her dead batteries, she suddenly realized that the zombie was standing right beside her, completely alive. Without a word, he grabbed her abruptly, offering no explanation. He began spinning her like a centrifuge while the president screamed desperately to be let go. Then, with tremendous force, the zombie hurled the woman toward the aircraft. She crashed into the cargo bay, landing inside safely. Now, with her crew at her side and secured within the aircraft, it was time to escape immediately. Realizing what the mutant had just done for her, the president suddenly became overwhelmed with distress. Meanwhile, the nuclear warhead continued its descent toward the abandoned city. The protagonist remained calm and confident, patiently waiting for its approach. Once again, gathering a considerable portion of his strength, he shattered the ground beneath his feet. Launching himself skyward with a powerful leap, he raced toward the ballistic missile. Now the two were on a direct collision course. Steadying one hand, the protagonist already knew exactly what he was going to do. As if it were nothing more than a simple baseball, he caught the projectile with a single hand, a feat so incomprehensible that those who witnessed it were left speechless. Immediately after, a massive explosion erupted in the sky above the city. The shockwave was so intense that it sent the aircraft into a sudden burst of turbulence. Behind them, the iconic mushroom cloud began to rise into the sky. Watching the utter devastation unfold, the president had no way of knowing if her savior had survived. The city, already abandoned, was now completely obliterated. Buildings that had once been merely desolate ruins were now almost entirely erased from existence. All the president could do was stare, convinced that nothing could have survived that. But then, unexpectedly, a scorched leg emerged from the thick smoke. The protagonist's clothes were almost completely destroyed, with only the strategically essential areas remaining intact. He scratched a rather private part of his anatomy, seemingly unaffected, as if all that nuclear energy had only managed to cause mild discomfort. After witnessing this, the long-haired mystery man declared that it was time to leave. However, his assistant pointed out that there were still life signals within the blast radius. The long-haired man scoffed, saying this wasn't the first time they had fought against the Academy, nor would it be the last. One day, he would eliminate them all. Meanwhile, the hero's aircrafts set course back to base. Inside, the president looked utterly desolate. Some of the crew approached her, concerned about her well-being. One of them remarked that it was truly ironic. She had spent her entire life fighting against zombies, only to be saved by one in the end. Her assistant stepped forward, explaining that there had likely been a massive misunderstanding. The one who saved her wasn't a zombie at all. He was a masked hero who had recently gained a reputation and had actually been living in the city for quite some time. Holding a tablet in her hands, the president crushed it in sheer frustration. Back in the city, people began noticing something unusual. Among them, a nearly naked man was walking through the streets as if nothing had happened. The protagonist made his way to the nearest telephone booth. In the past, these booths were used for making calls as they were equipped with landline telephones. His subordinates informed him that everyone was safe and that they were now searching for a secure place to live. Pleased with the news, he assured them that he would reunite with them soon, just as soon as he found a place to stay. Finally, the protagonist arrived at his apartment. He entered the numeric passcode to access the interior of his home. Inside the intelligence center, thanks to the city's surveillance cameras, they had finally discovered the whereabouts of the masked man. The protagonist glanced to the side, still deeply puzzled by everything that was happening. The women in the room were equally shocked upon seeing him on the monitor. He was practically half naked. Once inside his apartment, the protagonist hung some clothes to dry outside. Meanwhile, inside, he resumed his workout, motivating himself as he looked at a photograph. In it, he was gathered with the strongest of his associates. He hoped they had found his safe place, as he was eager to reunite with them soon. Suddenly, the president burst through his apartment door, startling him. She ordered her men to take every single piece of furniture. Nothing was to be left behind. Immediately, they obeyed her orders. Shocked, the protagonist demanded to know who they were, threatening to call the police. The president held out a piece of paper in front of his face, expecting him to understand the message. They were from the Academy of the Beyond, and they had come to inform him that he had been accepted. From that day forward, the protagonist was now a member of their organization. Discreetly, she gave an order to one of the security guards who had been accompanying her. The man grabbed the protagonist by the hand, who still had no idea what was going on. He tried to protest, saying he was a zombie and couldn't possibly go to school, but they simply assumed he was just a human with an extremely convincing disguise. After a brief exchange, they were all outside. One of the assistants pointed out that this was a bit inappropriate. The academy had extremely rigorous selection criteria, and since the place was highly organized, he wouldn't even have a room ready upon arrival. For the president, however, that was not a problem. He would simply stay in her apartment. Once inside the president's apartment, the security team began placing his furniture in the new space. Finally, all the heavy lifting was done. The guards politely took their leave, leaving the protagonist standing there, unsure of what to do. The president watched him intently, while he remained extremely uneasy about everything that had just happened. Feeling utterly embarrassed by the situation, he hesitantly asked if he would be staying there permanently, and more importantly, where he would be sleeping. To the president, it was obvious. He would stay there. She didn't understand why he kept insisting on the sleeping arrangement, even jokingly asking if he wanted to sleep next to her. Flustered, he quickly tried to correct himself, saying that wasn't what he meant. She must have misunderstood. But all he could think about was how absurd it was for a human and a zombie to share the same bed. Sensing his discomfort, the powerful president reassured him that he would be sleeping in the guest room. After that clarification, he tried once more to explain his identity, insisting that he was, in fact, a zombie. While he was speaking, the president began adjusting her prosthetic legs. That immediately caught the protagonist's attention. He hadn't noticed them before. Seeing her remove one of the prosthetics, he instantly panicked, demanding to know what had happened to her legs. With complete nonchalance, she casually replied that she had cut them off herself. Then, tilting her head, she asked if he had a problem with that. Without hesitation, he quickly assured her that he did not. She let out a deep sigh, lost in thought as she recalled the events that had led to her decision. The zombie outbreak happened when she was just a child. Her parents were infected almost immediately, and they ended up biting her legs. To survive, she had no choice but to defeat her own parents and cut off her legs. That was why she harbored such a deep, genuine hatred for all zombies, dedicating her entire life to their complete extermination. After this brief but not so bitter explanation, the protagonist began sweating nervously, realizing it would be best to avoid certain topics. Noticing that she had interrupted something he was saying earlier, she asked what it was about. He brushed it off, saying it was nothing, just nonsense, and that it was better if she hadn't heard it. Quickly changing the subject, he asked about this Academy of the Beyond. Violet, the president, explained that it was an organization specialized in perfecting ways to combat zombies. It had existed for over 1,000 years, founded 2 centuries after the first zombie pandemic outbreak. Its sole purpose was to fight against the creatures, and over the centuries, it had produced countless talents. The protagonist's memories were unclear, but he was certain he had become a zombie during the very first outbreak. Dwelling on the subject, he realized that he had been a zombie for almost a millennium. Violet told him to be prepared for the next day. She had used her connections to get him enlisted immediately. His expression exuded distrust. More than anything, he wanted to avoid showing up. But Violet warned him not to even think about running away. This wasn't an ordinary organization. An escape would trigger a large-scale investigation into his identity. Finally, she revealed her name, Violet. She also mentioned that a girl named Dawn would escort him to the academy the following day, and that they already knew each other. Intrigued by this, the protagonist insisted that he didn't know anyone named Dawn. Just then, a familiar hair color appeared in the distance, accompanied by slightly revealing clothes. Dawn greeted the new student politely, while the protagonist remained troubled by the entire situation. He stared at her, unable to recognize her at all. This only made his irritation more obvious. He had forgotten everything that happened inside the armored vehicle. The truth was, he remembered perfectly well, but in his memories, she had been much smaller. Hearing this, Dawn had to put in serious effort not to think her future classmate was a complete idiot. She urged him to hurry. It was almost time for the entrance exam. The two climbed the stairs leading to a plaza in front of the academy. He hadn't known he would have to take an exam. Dawn assured him that it was necessary to test the student's physical abilities and skills in exterminating zombies. She used an old world record for the 100-meter dash as an example. To be accepted into the academy, one had to at least run faster than that record. Now the name Academy of the Beyond made more sense. Dawn figured he should have already realized that this was a place for extraordinary individuals. In the protagonist's mind, the place was probably full of lunatics. This academy was just a glorified asylum. Welcome banners were scattered everywhere, and a massive crowd of students had gathered to take the exam. Looking closer, it all seemed genuinely dangerous. Since there were so many people, Dawn had to climb onto her classmate's shoulders to get a better view. An angry man, possibly due to being bald, shouted at her to shut up and that trash like them should stay far away. As they argued, the protagonist questioned whether someone capable of holding an entire airplane should even have to take the exam. But it wasn't that simple. Many people there were capable of feats like that. Not to mention, there was a small detail. Almost no one at the academy watched television news. A man with a wooden leg began climbing the stairs, telling everyone to calm down. Clearing his throat, he spoke into the microphone. Welcoming everyone, he announced that he would be the examiner for the day. His name was Chen, and he was the president of the sports department. The academy had been around for 800 years, and many great talents had joined its ranks. In the old days, its founders could split entire mountains in half. Today, however, he didn't expect candidates to do the same. In the middle of the crowd, someone called out to President Chen. It was none other than the beloved protagonist, timidly raising his hand to ask a question. He nervously inquired what would happen if a zombie happened to be inside the academy. The answer was simple. It would be completely dismembered and his body would be hung from the academy gates after being neutralized. The protagonist didn't quite understand that last part. What did neutralized mean? Professor Chen clarified it would separate the smaller head from the larger body of the zombie. Just imagining such suffering made the protagonist freeze in horror. Finally, the exams began, starting with the 100-meter sprint. The students took their positions, waiting for the referee's signal. The examiner fired the starter pistol, signaling the beginning of the race. The wind caused by the students' movement was so powerful that it distorted the referee's facial features. Among them was an exceptionally fast student, clearly leading the race. The boy moved like a lightning bolt, finishing in just 3 seconds. Crossing the finish line, he had to exert significant effort to slow down, tearing up the ground in the process, while the protagonist ran as discreetly as possible. Next was the targeting exam, where they had to hit designated targets. Shooting was considered the most basic survival skill in this world plagued by zombies. Somehow the protagonist found himself dragged into the evaluation, despite not knowing how he ended up in this mess. Preparing to take aim, he observed his classmate's technique. Dawn demonstrated incredible proficiency with weapons, showcasing skill far beyond the average level. She hurled several knives toward the targets. Each blade found its mark, slicing through the heads with extreme precision, as if guided by an unseen force. After achieving such a flawless result, she flashed a small smile. She had passed the exam with flying colors. Meanwhile, the protagonist was struggling to figure out how to properly use a firearm. He couldn't help but notice how energetic the other examinees were, and he felt a growing sense of unease. He had to remember Director Chen's words. After all, he was almost certainly the only zombie in the entire city. The next test was a simple throwing event. Candidates needed to throw objects at least 80 meters to pass, while 100 meters or more would place them in the top tier. The first few candidates stepped up to throw. This test proved to be more difficult than the others, and some students began to fail. The director called up the next group. The protagonist found himself trapped among these lunatics. To avoid drawing too much attention, he carefully controlled his own strength. As he completed the tests, Director Chen analyzed the protagonist's statistics, noticing that he was only doing the bare minimum to pass. However, he had received a direct message from Violet. She had assured him that this boy was incredibly strong. Knowing the president's word, Director Chen was certain this guy had to be phenomenal. The only explanation for his lackluster results was that he was deliberately pretending to be weak. One of the candidates stepped up for the final test, ready to throw his spear. He hurled it with the force of a projectile, and the spear cut through the sky like a bullet. It traveled at an incredible speed toward its target. Unfortunately, it struck the training dummy in a very fragile and delicate part of its anatomy. Watching that scene only made the protagonist more anxious about being discovered. The force of the throw was so immense that the spear dragged multiple dummies with it. All of them ended up impaled against a traffic sign. In the center of the city, people who had no idea that this was part of an exam were stunned by the sudden appearance of flying training dummies. Even Director Chen was impressed. This candidate's spear had traveled an astonishing 32 kilometers. That performance was definitely enough to qualify. Now it was the protagonist's turn. As he stepped up to the test area, the promising candidate who had just thrown his spear attempted to intimidate him. The protagonist calmly picked up the spear. He glanced upward, mentally preparing for his throw. But before he could do anything, Director Chen ordered him to stop. Since he hadn't interrupted anyone else during the entire exam, this immediately caught the attention of the other candidates. The director wanted to confirm something. Was this really the man known as Zombie, personally recommended by the president of fencing? According to her, he was incredibly strong, yet that wasn't reflected in the exam statistics. The director wanted to know if he was hiding his true power. Moreover, he was the same person who had earlier asked about zombies. Everyone here was giving their absolute best to pass, so the director wanted to know if he was also giving his all. Panicking under the scrutiny, the protagonist desperately tried to convince them that he was definitely a person. Absolutely, without a doubt, a real human being. If that were true, then the director ordered him to show the full extent of his potential. He didn't need to exceed 32 kilometers. If he could throw at least 10% of that, he would qualify. If he failed, the director would assume he had tricked the president, which would make him a suspected spy, one that would be severely punished. Terrified, the protagonist started thinking. He was still afraid of humans. After all, he had spent centuries running from them. He never wanted to be enslaved again. But he had lived this long with a clear goal in mind. Determined, he resolved to throw the spear as far as he could. Because of this unusual interaction with the director, all eyes were on him. For the first time in the entire exam, he focused seriously. He remembered the suffering of his strength training, the pain of the bench press, the agony of countless failed bicep curls. The sheer power within his body began to accumulate so intensely that the ground beneath him started to crack apart. Then he threw the spear. A massive shockwave erupted from the force, sending a wave of intimidation through the other candidates. His throw was so powerful that it destroyed his satellite in Earth's orbit. If it weren't for the moon acting as a barrier, the spear would have continued traveling into deep space. The sheer force of his throw violently launched multiple candidates across the field. The ground beneath them had been completely obliterated. Faced with such an overwhelming display of raw strength, even Director Chen was left utterly speechless. The fact was, if one could see the moon in greater detail, they would notice the damage left by the spear. All of this was caused by just a small fraction of the protagonist's power. After the shockwave, the other examinees began falling from the sky, as if it were raining failures. The protagonist needed a moment to regain himself. Even his facial expression had changed from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. He stared at the moon, still fixed in the sky, certain that his spear had been on a direct trajectory toward it. Finally, he returned to his usual demeanor. Around him, everyone remained completely stunned. Dawn approached him, thrilled by his results. Even the director had been left speechless, despite saying nothing. She wanted to know just how far the spear could have gone, but he couldn't answer. He had simply done his best. Meanwhile, in space, the broken-off piece of the moon was now a drifting asteroid. Floating aimlessly between the Earth and its satellite, it was not happy about the situation. Now that he had officially qualified, the protagonist hoped he could finally go home. Dawn, however, thought that was ridiculous. With that kind of power, he could become president someday. Completely excited about his potential, she asked if he had any idea how much power a president could wield. Reflecting on this, he realized he knew nothing about human society. The most direct example was Violet herself. Her authority allowed her to command a massive army, granting her access to even nuclear weapons. Not only that, but she was the supreme authority over a city of 30 million people. Even though an elected official technically existed, he was just a secretary. The real ruler was her. The protagonist attempted to mention that he already had his own city, but Dawn ignored him entirely, driving him somewhere else. They had now arrived at the biotechnology department, the place where special weapons were crafted, also known as the logistics department. As they strolled through the facility, something peculiar caught the protagonist's eye. In front of him was a small photograph of what appeared to be a happy family. The picture belonged to Professor Jamie, who was presumed to be dead. He was the former president of this department. After losing his wife, he had become obsessed with crazy experiments, ones that involved both humans and zombies. Because of this, he had been fired for going completely insane. Just then, a woman wearing glasses greeted them, asking if they were new students and if they had passed the academy's entrance exam. And indeed, they had both been officially admitted. Zombie wanted to know who this woman was. Dawn explained that she was Professor Jamie's adopted daughter and that she was now the current head of the biotechnology department. Inviting them to sit down, she asked what kind of equipment they would need. With a gleam in her eyes, Dawn eagerly requested something that would allow her to carry even more weapons. Her childish imagination suggested a skirt that could hide a massive machine gun. In short, she would be joining the group of gunners. Then the scientist turned to the protagonist, wanting to know what he wanted. But after asking the question, she received no answer. Revealing his severely low self-esteem, Zombie timidly asked if she had actually been talking to him. Upon getting a better look at his face, the woman suddenly went pale with terror. She had immediately realized he was a zombie. Dawn, still smiling, brushed it off, insisting that it was just a really convincing mask. The scientist, now fully alarmed, asked if Dawn was just stupid or actively choosing to ignore reality. That was clearly a zombie. At this point, Zombie was already trembling in fear. Dawn insisted that she wasn't lying. She had seen part of his face during the last exam. Now a little calmer, the scientist hesitated. If he were truly a zombie, wouldn't he have attacked someone by now? Still, she repeated her question. What kind of equipment did he want? After thinking for a moment, he confirmed that whenever he used his strength, he always ended up going home naked. So his request was simple. He wanted clothes that would never tear. An unusual request, one that made the scientist pause and think. She noted down the requests: a girl who wanted to carry more weapons and a zombie who just didn't want to end up naked. Meanwhile, in the reserved fencing area, a group was gathered in deep thought. Among them was Marshall, who had been completely obliterated by the protagonist. A woman lay on a bench, a book covering her face, waiting to hear the report. The samurai explained that his opponent was truly powerful. The moment he attacked, his vision had gone completely black, and in the very next second, his body was already dangling from a streetlight. The woman wanted to know if the president of his division would be capable of defeating this creature. Without hesitation, the samurai admitted that this being was even stronger than his own president. Finally, the woman sat up, slamming her book onto the table. She wanted to know the name of the person who had defeated him. A blue-haired woman leaned in, listening intently for the answer. After hearing it, she dismissed him, saying he was free to go. Her name was Zhang Lanqi, and she was the president of the Sword Division. There was fierce rivalry between the Sword Division and the Blade Division. As he left, the samurai wished her a good day. During a theory class, students were learning about zombie habits. They discovered that zombies also enjoyed eating eggs, and that this knowledge could be used to set traps. Zombie appeared to be a very dedicated student, diligently taking notes on everything he heard. Dawn grew curious about what he was writing and asked what he was doing. He told her he wanted to share this knowledge with his family. Of all the things he could have said, this was definitely not what she'd expected. Suddenly, a loud announcement echoed through the school, summoning everyone to the gymnasium immediately. Dawn found this sudden gathering odd. It hadn't been long since they had all last assembled. Slowly, students began filling the center of the gym. They just wanted to know what was going on while casually eating their ice cream. Violet ordered them to be silent. Meanwhile, Dawn was amazed that her classmate could still eat while wearing a mask. He tried explaining how it was possible, but as he spoke, a group of individuals began approaching. The blue-haired girl watched the protagonist from a distance, unimpressed. Since he had fallen in battle before, she assumed he couldn't be that strong. She asked if she should go over and test this boy. Her president gave her approval. Immediately, she unsheathed her sword. But before anything could happen, a new group of individuals entered the gymnasium. At the front was the chief, followed by an army of robots. His mere presence was enough to make all the students start moving. Dawn quickly ordered her classmate to stop staring and bow. This was the Department of Mechanical Life. As the machines filled the hall, everyone bowed in silence. The presidents exchanged brief glances. He warned the girl not to start any conflicts in that place. Facing the reprimand, she said she would be leaving. But as she walked away, she asked if they were still planning to test the boy's abilities somehow. However, there was a quick change of plans. The chief was far more important than this boy, and she only respected the truly strong. The chief approached Violet, acknowledging that she had been working hard, but she simply replied that it was just her job. Zombie wondered if there was something going on between the two of them. The atmosphere had completely changed. Looking at his classmate, he asked if the chief was really such a powerful figure. Dawn then reminded him of Professor Jamie, the man who had been exiled from the academy. The chief was an enhanced version of a modern human, the masterpiece of that insane professor. The only one among thousands to survive brutal experiments, he now ruled a city of 50 million inhabitants. And in 10 years of leadership, not a single zombie had appeared in his city. The mere sighting of a single strand of zombie hair led to the violent cleansing of the entire area. Stepping onto the stage, the chief announced that he would be brief. Though they were all newcomers, the academy needed help. The students listened in complete silence. Looking at one of his machines, he ordered a projection to be displayed immediately. From what seemed like the eye on his face, a hologram of a seated person was projected. This was a spy they had captured months ago. Because of him, a nuclear disaster had nearly occurred. Zombie immediately boiled with rage. This was the man who had fired the nuclear weapon at him. Even though the spy deserved to be punished, he possessed information too valuable to be disposed of. He was a loyal subordinate of Professor Jamie. The protagonist realized that there was more than one enemy threatening humanity. In the present day, the threat of zombies had diminished. The greatest danger to humanity was humanity itself. Clearly, there were still people who just wanted to watch the world burn. They had tried countless interrogation methods, but none had succeeded. Not even the senior students had been able to break him. So far, not a single method, no matter how cruel, had been able to make the spy speak. That was why the chief had turned to the newcomers. Any assistance would be welcome. Whoever managed to make him talk would be immediately promoted to the position of vice president. The newcomers lit up at the promise of power. A large crowd of them eagerly volunteered to interrogate the spy. Looking at them, the chief announced that the prisoner was in a room outside and wished them luck. 2 hours passed and the situation remained unchanged. The newcomers had been getting creative, attempting unorthodox methods of interrogation. Violet watched with her hand on her face, completely unimpressed by their ineffective tactics. Dawn wondered if her new friend could make the prisoner talk. The truth was, if he wanted to, Zombie could make the man sing like a bird. Hearing those words didn't make Dawn doubt him. On the contrary, she was even more excited. Raising her hand, she called for the chief's attention, announcing that her friend had a way to make the spy talk. Since they had nothing to lose, the chief immediately directed them to the interrogation room. Even though she was excited, Dawn found Zombie's sudden willingness strange. Until now, he had been trying to stay unnoticed. Zombie's subordinates were always obedient, but for some reason, a few had been losing control lately. Maybe this year would provide some answers. He entered the room, coming face to face with a prisoner. On the other side, the spy wasn't surprised at all. He simply saw that another person had arrived. The protagonist approached him, while the prisoner watched him cautiously. They stared at each other for a brief moment without saying a word. Assuming that the academy had run out of interrogators, the spy made it clear that he would never betray his brother Faye. The moment he finished speaking, Zombie moved fast. In a split second, he made a small cut on the spy's arm. After enduring countless interrogation sessions, the spy had no idea what such a tiny wound could possibly mean. He laughed hysterically. He wasn't afraid of anything. This was nothing more than a mosquito bite. Zombie then gave a simple order. He commanded the spy to stand up. Without even thinking, the spy obeyed. This immediately caught the attention of every important figure in the room. Something inside that tiny wound had forced him to comply. Small cells had entered the spy's bloodstream. They were now traveling through his body and had already reached his brain. The spy's body trembled, not because he was afraid, but because he had completely lost control over himself. He no longer had any say in his own existence. Zombie's first question was simple: his name. The answer came immediately. His name was Shou Kai. Dawn was shocked. She had just witnessed her friend's ability to control someone's mind. Presuming that as Jamie's subordinate, the spy must know a lot. The protagonist asked if that was the case. The young man confirmed he knew almost everything. With that in mind, Zombie wanted to know why the zombies were losing control. The answer was a drug, one that had been secretly released into the city. Zombies who consumed it would go berserk, and in some cases, they could even be controlled remotely. They sent these zombies to attack humans, collecting combat data to analyze the Academy of the Beyond. The protagonist demanded to know why they were doing this. The spy didn't know the full answer, but he did know that his superior was excited. Jamie was gathering critical data for some unknown purpose. When asked where Jamie was now, the spy revealed that he was in a secret base 500 meters underground beneath City-ish. After hearing the answer, Zombie ordered the spy to turn his back to him. As he left the room, he spoke in zombie language, saying that humans were hateful creatures, and that the virus inside the spy's brain could end his life whenever Zombie wished. But instead, he hoped that the man would be able to change his path. The spy understood the message, and the door shut behind the protagonist as he walked away. Meanwhile, Professor Jamie was exactly where the spy had said. They had already received intel that their captured agent had revealed important information. The Academy of the Beyond likely knew their exact location now. Even so, Jamie remained deep in thought. This wasn't important to him. They had to continue their research. In fact, he was glad the Academy was coming to him. His assistant panicked. This was far too dangerous. But since the experiment was nearing completion, Jamie wasn't worried at all. Walking up to one of his creations, he declared that the timing was perfect. He wanted his enemies to witness this historic moment, the birth of a new form of life. Zombie walked out of the interrogation room as if nothing had happened. Outside, he was watched with fear by the other students. Whispers spread among those who had seen what he had done. Even Violet looked uneasy. The true scale of his power was starting to sink in. The blue-haired woman was just as intrigued by what had happened. It was unanimous. Everyone now believed that somehow he had the ability to control minds. The chief began clapping, saying that Zombie had done an excellent job. He declared that this new generation would surpass the old one. He hadn't expected such a talent to appear among the freshmen. Since he had promised to make him vice president, he would do it immediately, as long as Zombie was officially registered. Zombie, however, was more worried about Jamie's whereabouts. The chief, however, knew he wouldn't run away. They continued walking, being closely watched by the blue-haired woman. Her subordinate found it strange. There wasn't supposed to be a procedure for becoming vice president. They decided to follow them. The group walked into an isolated area, an industrial zone. Zombie had no idea why they had gone there. He had assumed they were heading to complete his registration. The chief suddenly asked him, when did he learn to speak human language? Because he knew that Zombie was a zombie. Zombie looked confused. Was the chief really talking to him? Turning toward him, the chief raised his weapon. Yes, he said. I'm talking to you. Then he fired. A powerful shot struck Zombie directly. The blue-haired woman and her subordinate, who had been watching in secret, were nearly caught in the blast. By some miracle, they were unharmed. The weapon used was the chief's tachyon cannon, a weapon capable of disintegrating any form of matter. The chief declared that he would never be fooled by a zombie. He wanted to know what the idiots at the academy were thinking. How had something like this gone unnoticed? But in the end, it didn't matter, because all zombies had the same weakness: their heads. And with their heads destroyed, they stopped moving. This zombie had entered a place he never should have. The protagonist's hand was already reaching for the chief's face. A series of rapid movements followed, until a wall was obliterated, sending debris flying everywhere. The chief suddenly found himself with Zombie's hand gripping his throat. At that very moment, other figures emerged. The robots that always followed the chief appeared instantly. They fired their powerful beams without hesitation. A massive explosion erupted, engulfing the entire area. When the smoke cleared, the protagonist stood, holding a destroyed combat drone. Taking advantage of the chaos, the chief had escaped, jumping to safety. Dragging his feet across the cold concrete, he was still in shock. He couldn't comprehend what had just happened. His robots had been completely obliterated. That zombie should be dead. No headless body should be able to move. And yet, The headless body was still active. The blue-haired woman and her subordinate were just as stunned as the chief. Without saying a word, Zombie kept fighting. The chief had to stay completely focused, because he had barely avoided being decapitated himself. Somehow, he managed to dodge every attack thrown at him. Managing to buy some time, the chief prepared his cannon once again. He fired a new shot, but this time, he failed to hit his target. He was completely unable to understand why this zombie was so agile, even without a head. But there was no time to think. He needed to focus on keeping his own head. Once again, he gained distance to avoid being struck by the zombie. The subordinate assumed he was struggling, but the blue-haired woman stated that the chief was just getting started. People like him preferred to display overwhelming power. It was best to step back before they got caught in the conflict. Finally, something began to form on the zombie's body. His head had completely regenerated. Seeing it grow back left everyone stunned. The protagonist suggested that they talk as he had no intention of harming anyone present. The chief remained silent for a long moment. He had just realized that his neck had been lightly wounded. Imagining that the zombie's true goal was to control his mind, he refused to comply. He removed his coat, revealing his robotic body. Model number 1. He gave the command and a different robot began approaching. As it drew closer, its parts separated and began attaching to him. A transformation was underway and the protagonist could only watch. He didn't know what he was witnessing, but the boy on the rooftop was in awe. Now the chief was covered in a sleek, high-tech armor. After all, he was a mechanical life form, and it was not in his nature to negotiate with zombies. As the first zombie to ever witness this form, the protagonist should feel honored. The chief was now faster and far more powerful, striking with devastating force. He positioned himself mid-air to land a crushing blow on the protagonist. His attack was so overwhelming that he managed to launch him high into the sky. The blue-haired woman and her student were shocked by the intensity of the battle. But the chief wasn't done yet. He hadn't shown the full extent of his offensive power. While the zombie was still airborne, he struck him multiple times. Each attack was precise and brutal, yet his opponent didn't even react to a single hit. This only made the chief even more confident despite the fact that the zombie's body remained completely intact. This time, he struck hard enough to send his opponent crashing toward the ground. His body hit the concrete like a soccer ball. Moments later, the chief landed as well. To him, all zombies had to be exterminated. He crossed his arms in front of his chest as if charging an attack of total destruction. Then he unleashed a deadly energy beam capable of consuming everything in its path. The blue-haired woman was stunned by such a display of power. It was the same beam he had used earlier, but this time, it was exponentially stronger. The shockwaves swept through the abandoned city. There was nothing left that could have survived that attack. The chief exhaled heavily, exhausted from what he had just done. He hoped his enemy was finally gone. But then, he saw him walking casually in his direction. The chief couldn't believe it. This shouldn't be possible. For the first time in the battle, the protagonist acted differently. He roared, completely enraged. The force of his scream violently pushed away the debris. The blue-haired woman had to shield herself from the dust. Even the chief had to cover his ears. The roar was too intense. The protagonist had transformed. Defying the rules of Dragon Ball, he now had a pair of ears and hair. Nobody had any idea what had just happened to the zombie. Showing off his new hairstyle, he approached the chief. At this point, the chief had accepted it. He had no idea what the being in front of him truly was. The protagonist's skin tone remained the same, but his hair looked like something that had been popular in the early 2010s. Slowly, the dust began to clear, and in the sky above them, the clouds darkened further. A massive whirlpool of clouds began forming. Dawn, looking out the window, noticed something was wrong. The blue-haired president's student was also concerned. This wasn't normal at all. Inside the city, the bystanders were confused. They didn't understand why the sky had suddenly gone dark. It was the first time they had ever seen anything like this. Back in the battle, the chief couldn't say a word. He was dealing with a bigger issue, one that had just happened inside his underwear. The protagonist spoke. He had given this arrogant human several chances to resolve things peacefully. Now he wanted to know something very specific. Did the chief have an intense desire to find out if there was life after death? His entire personality had shifted. The blue-haired woman felt a deep sense of dread. She knew they had to leave immediately. The chief, despite his fear, refused to back down. Since his birth, he had never once felt threatened by any living being. And there was no way that some ex-bald guy would be the first to do that to him. Bracing himself, he challenged the creature to try something. Meanwhile, the blue-haired woman and her student continued their escape. There was no record of a zombie like this in the Academy's database, and they didn't even know if they were far enough away yet. Before she could say anything, an object suddenly flew past them. The battle's danger level was beyond anything ever seen before. The chief's body had seen better days. Now he was nothing more than a broken, overconfident paperweight. The ex-bald protagonist just watched calmly. He knew this human was no longer a threat. Even in his weakened state, the chief still tried. He called for more of his robot models. They marched toward the battle fearlessly. They felt nothing. Multiple explosions erupted immediately after. Somehow, the blue-haired woman had managed to rescue the chief. That zombie was truly dangerous. He would need help to defeat him. Realizing the severity of the situation, the blue-haired woman scolded the chief. He was insane. He shouldn't have provoked him. They decided to split up and escape. But a round of applause for the chief. He still managed to do something stupid, even while being a paperweight. The protagonist noticed that the humans had started fleeing. It was time to show them something truly interesting. The blue-haired woman had no idea what was about to happen next. Suddenly, massive cracks began spreading across the ground. It was the protagonist's hand that had caused it. Beneath their feet, An earthquake had begun. It happened too fast. There was already an obstacle in her way. Everything unfolding before her eyes was simply surreal. With just one hand, the zombie was doing something truly unbelievable. Even the paperweight had his escape completely thwarted. Defying both the laws of physics and common sense, half of the city was lifted into the air, as if it were a wall. The massive structure now dominated the horizon. Inside the city, the bystanders couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. Dawn realized it was as if the city itself was floating. Even though she was far from the battle, it was obvious that something extraordinary was happening. All of this, caused by the protagonist's sheer strength. With the human's escape completely blocked, he resumed his pursuit of the paperweight. Grabbing his face with one hand, he dragged him to the edge of the city. With the paperweight within his grasp, he asked, "Now do you feel threatened?" Holding the stump of a man in his hand, the protagonist wasn't impressed at all. In the end, he confirmed something. He was right. He couldn't control the mind of a robot, but since the chief was still partly human, his brain must still be intact. He tightened his grip on the paperweight's skull, as they're sending a command to the viral cells in his bloodstream. The virus had now reached his brain. Suddenly, he saw his memories. Since childhood, he had been an orphan. He had undergone numerous bodily modifications, so many that there was almost nothing human left in him. The protagonist was certain this paperweight's life was miserable. Staying alive was more painful than dying. Dropping him over the edge of the cliff, he said, "Seeing those memories ruined my mood." Luckily, he didn't fall to his death. He was saved by the blue-haired woman. She had witnessed the entire final interaction. She was stunned by the fact that the zombie could read memories. With nothing left to do there, he disappeared like a lightning bolt. The next morning, he woke up in a panic. He knew he had lost control of his emotions again. Being in that form was terrifying for him. He had to constantly remind himself he was a good and kind zombie. After packing his bags, he prepared to leave the human city. But as soon as he tried to sneak away, Violet appeared. She demanded to know, "Where do you think you're going?" Still shaken, he began to worry. He didn't want to silence a witness. Rushing toward her, he apologized for what he was about to do. But his attack stopped abruptly when he saw something strange. A document. It was his official appointment as vice president. The document was simply a formalization of what he had already earned. Holding the paper in his hands, he stood there, unable to comprehend the situation. He struggled to believe it was real. Was that truly the chief's signature? Violet confirmed it was. Immediately, he asked, "Did the chief say anything?" According to Violet, the only thing the chief said was, "The vice president is an excellent human being." As she left, she added, "I look forward to the day you become president. On that day, you will finally accomplish what you set out to do." Inside a hospital room, the paperweight was slowly recovering. The blue-haired woman was frustrated by his decision, because now they had a zombie as their vice president. But to the chief, that wasn't the problem. The strength of that creature was necessary to capture Professor Jamie. Even so, the woman remained wary. What if the zombie lost control again? The chief didn't care. Instead, he asked, "Have you prepared everything?" There was only one goal now, to completely eradicate Professor Jamie. Out in the ocean, several massive warships were sailing. Meanwhile, at the zombie refuge, one of them was rallying the masses. He claimed their king had been captured by the humans. The king was their only pillar of support. They couldn't lose him like this. Slowly, more and more zombies began agreeing with the idea of retaliation. Some of the other leaders merely watched Varmin's stupidity, but they chose not to intervene, because only the king could stop this. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier continued its course through the ocean. The chief issued an order to all personnel. This is our only chance to capture Professor Jamie, no matter the cost. In an abandoned city, the protagonist was walking alongside Dawn. She was amazed by the location. Suddenly, a large regiment of soldiers approached. They stood before him and saluted. They were ready to receive orders from their new, mighty, all-powerful leader, Vice President Zombie. They stated their allegiance. They were the 4th Division. From now on, they would only take orders from him. The poor zombie was left speechless. He never expected to have this much military power. That regiment alone had not only countless war tanks, it was composed of 12,000 soldiers. Not believing that they would obey any command, the protagonist asked what the soldier would do if he ordered him to end his own life. Without hesitation, the soldier immediately pulled out a grenade, declaring that the vice president's orders were absolute. It had been an honor to serve him. The zombie panicked and quickly told him to stop. He had only been joking. He had to throw the grenade far away before he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. A side character with protagonist syndrome struggled to accept the vice president's authority, assuming he must be weak. He couldn't understand why someone so fragile was in charge of such a critical region. They introduced themselves as members of the Academy of Stainless Steel. They had been sent to assist with capturing the target. Dawn recognized them immediately. It was President Bang and Vice President Chui. They looked incredibly strong. Meanwhile, on the aircraft carrier, a samurai questioned his presence on this mission. He didn't understand why he had been deployed or how a newcomer had been promoted to vice president. The blue-haired woman reminded him that he had been sent to assist, not to voice his opinions. He needed to understand his place. Gang, however, was still confused. Why had a rookie been put in charge of such a strategic position? The chief casually replied, "If you don't believe in him, the rookie can beat you until you cry." Gang laughed, thinking it was a bluff. He was certain he was stronger than the chief. Inside his fortress, Professor Jamie observed a massive military mobilization. The city where he was hiding was completely surrounded by enemies. He authorized the release of the zombies. With a single button press, a horde of undead surged forward. A young man wearing glasses noticed something odd among them. One of the zombies was different. There were many of them, but they were no match for modern firearms. The overconfident side characters complained that the task was too easy. As they approached the fallen zombies, the protagonist realized something. They didn't belong to his tribe. Dawn, standing beside him, pretended she hadn't heard anything. The cocky soldier sneered at the vice president, telling him to return home to safety since he was useless. Weaklings like him should be playing video games instead. That comment irritated the protagonist. But before he could react, they were suddenly interrupted by the arrival of a powerful zombie. Looking at the creature, the protagonist immediately recognized him. He had no idea what the little varmint was doing there. The young man in glasses was thrilled. This was the first time he had seen such a powerful zombie. Excited, he hoped the creature would put on a real show. Hours earlier, Varmint had failed to convince the other zombies to join him. Only number 7 had followed. 7 had only come to drop off gasoline and planned to leave immediately. He refused to disobey the king's orders but wished his friend good luck. Varmint was confident that the king wouldn't find out. He called his companion a coward. Brimming with self-assurance, he declared that he didn't need anyone. He could wipe out the humans on his own. Then, he suddenly caught a strange scent. There was that smell that alerted the mad scientist to his presence. And just like that, the little varmint had encountered the human forces. Dawn had no idea what that creature was. Meanwhile, the protagonist was worried about his friend. Varmint began drinking straight from the gasoline canister. The liquid poured down his body from his ravenous consumption. Dawn was completely baffled by what she was witnessing. Finally, the zombie revved up his chainsaw. With a furious roar, he prepared to begin the slaughter. The sound was so intense that windows shattered, while Dawn covered her ears. Even the other soldiers had to shield themselves from the noise. The only one unaffected was the protagonist. The sonic shockwave was so powerful that it threw people flying in every direction. Dawn was growing more terrified by the second. This creature was dangerous. Varmint, filled with rage, declared his intent to eliminate all humans. One of the stainless steel soldiers was excited at the chance to fight. He believed he could win. The vice president didn't hesitate. He grabbed Dawn by the arm and started running. She didn't understand why they were fleeing. There were 2 powerful warriors who could help. With perfect calm, the protagonist explained. The stainless steel soldiers had no chance of winning. Dawn was worried by that statement. The zombie assured her he wasn't joking. That chainsaw-wielding zombie was truly strong. Then, he revealed the truth. Varmint possessed an immortal body. The stainless steel soldiers laughed at the vice president for running away. But before they could keep mocking him, one of their own was suddenly getting beaten senseless. He was thrown with such force that he crashed through a war tank. The cocky soldier turned to see what had just happened. But his back was now turned to his opponent. On the other side, his subordinate was foaming at the mouth, completely unconscious. Only then did he realize the zombie was right in front of him. Varmint, with eerie politeness, asked, "How would you like to die?" Hide above. On the rooftop of a building, the protagonist had brought his allies to safety. On the avenue below, the destruction raged uncontrollably. The boy with glasses was thrilled. This was the most powerful zombie he had ever seen. The stainless steel soldier, however, was not enjoying how the fight was going. One moment he was getting beaten, and the next moment, he was getting beaten again. That supposedly strong human was nothing more than a toy in the hands of his enemy. He fell to the ground like a rotten fruit dropping from a tree, only to be immediately kicked in the head, like a penalty kick. His body flew across the battlefield, crashing into his already unconscious subordinate. Finally, the chainsaw-wielding creature approached, his weapon still revving viciously. It was in that moment that the stainless steel soldier realized he would never be able to wear that pair of underwear again. If not for the blade on his arm, he would have had a very unpleasant time. Up on the rooftop, the protagonist silently observed the battle. Dawn was nervous, but she was certain that soldier would not survive much longer. Below them, the stainless steel soldier did his best to turn the fight around. He stared deeply into the creature's eyes, only to freeze in terror and cry out for his mother. He didn't want to die like this. A genuinely embarrassing moment witnessed by 2 people who wished they hadn't seen it. Meanwhile, hidden in his laboratory, the mad scientist was delighting in the suffering of humans. The beating continued while the protagonist simply watched. Regular soldiers couldn't be deployed, it would be completely useless. Filled with fear, one of them asked the vice president, "What are you going to do?" In truth, the protagonist didn't understand why his own subordinate hadn't recognized him. Turning to Dawn, he said, "You'll be responsible for bringing that thing to its senses, through violence." Dawn panicked immediately. She was certain that she wasn't capable of doing anything. Then the vice president extended his hand. He asked her to hold out her arm. Then, he bit her. Dawn screamed in shock. It took her a moment to process what had just happened. She thought he was about to control her mind and turn her into a puppet. But the zombie reassured her. "I'm not that kind of person. All he asked, just don't hit him too hard." On the battlefield, the stainless steel soldier continued to squirm for his life. The chainsaw zombie was enjoying his suffering. Then, a voice interrupted. "That doesn't look fun at all." The zombie turned, hearing the sound of mocking laughter. Dawn took a step forward, driving along a massive machine gun. Completely transformed, she challenged the monster. "Why don't you play with me instead?" The zombie cells inside her body activated immediately. They spread rapidly, rewriting her original genetic code. New nucleotide chains formed. and she became something entirely different from what she once was. The chainsaw zombie was intrigued by this tiny little girl standing before him. Then, he became furious. How dare such a small, insignificant creature act so boldly? Dawn smirked. You're just a big loudmouth, and honestly, there's nothing special about you. Before he could respond, she unleashed a barrage of bullets. The projectiles surged forward, but the zombie didn't move. He dodged effortlessly, weaving through the gunfire like it was nothing. Meanwhile, the stainless steel soldier curled into a fetal position, trying to hide. The poor guy was crying, praying that no one would find out what had happened to his underwear. The battle grew fiercer. The other stainless steel soldier took the opportunity to rescue his commander. By now, Dawn had closed the distance. She could land a powerful strike, but instead, she shoved multiple grenades into the chainsaw zombie's mouth. This is just dessert, she whispered. Then, she detonated them. The explosion sent her flying backward, but the chainsaw zombie simply dusted himself off. That didn't even hurt. Actually, it tickled. Before he could finish his sentence, Dawn punched him in the face. Over and over. She was having fun. She liked the fact that he was a resilient punching bag. Terrified, the soldier asked the vice president, "What did you do to her?" And he learned her genes had been modified. Without a doubt, she could still become even stronger. Finally, Varmint admitted he was starting to feel pain. Meanwhile, Dawn grinned uncontrollably. She loved this feeling. The stainless steel soldiers didn't know what was scarier at this point. Without hesitation, Varmint declared, "That little strength of yours isn't enough to stop me." But he was abruptly caught off guard. The girl had already jumped onto his chainsaw. She landed a powerful kick to his face, so hard that he nearly sprouted wings. As his body flew through the air, his expression couldn't hide the pain he felt. He rolled across the ground for several meters, completely overpowered. Upside down, he struggled to understand what had just happened. Even so, the battle continued, destroying the avenue completely. The stainless steel soldiers were stunned by the girl's strength. They assumed she had been faking weakness all along. Lifting a massive bazooka, she announced, "It's time for some bang bang." From his vantage point, the protagonist noticed something unusual. Varmint was complaining about his pain. Then, he grabbed another can of gasoline to drink. Both combatants were having fun. Meanwhile, the stainless steel soldiers were in full-blown panic. The bazooka fired. The projectile soared toward the creature, but mid-flight, the missile was sliced in half. Varmint had moved so fast, it shocked the girl. Her body was shredded in the process. The air was filled with an overwhelming red mist. The stainless steel soldiers were horrified. To them, she was already dead. Varmint declared confidently, "I can't be defeated. Humans are wasting their time trying." Up on the rooftop, the protagonist closed his fist. That single gesture was enough to command the zombie cells to do their magic. Her body began regenerating completely. Varmint watched in disbelief. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. That's when Dawn spoke. "I become undead too." The stainless steel soldiers were completely horrified. With her wounds fully restored, the fight between them seemed endless. Dawn wanted to keep having fun. The stainless steel soldiers, however, were terrified. They had never seen so many lunatics in one place. At this point, all they wanted was for someone to save them. Varmint was shaken. He no longer knew who the real zombie was in this battle. The vice president watched carefully. Meanwhile, his soldier tried his best not to ruin his underwear again. He hadn't expected the girl to become so powerful. Her body was evolving rapidly. The pain she felt was extremely real. Knowing that he had to put an end to this quickly, it was time to discipline his subordinate. Dawn was becoming more dangerous as the fight progressed. With lightning-fast agility, she closed the gap between herself and her opponent once again. Her attacks were so fast and powerful, Varmint couldn't react. He was hurled across the city like a punching bag, pummeled from every angle, in the girl's hands. He had become completely useless. Lying on the ground, defeated, he struggled to understand what this creature before him was. He got no answer. Instead, his head was repeatedly smashed into the pavement. Finally, he screamed in desperation, "I surrender. Please, no more." He pleaded for mercy. "I'll leave immediately. Just stop hitting me." The vice president observed the situation calmly. Meanwhile, far away, the mad scientist was also watching. Finally, the girl planted her machine gun into the ground. Varmint sighed in relief. He had finally gotten a break from his punishment. Then, he took the opportunity to launch a sneak attack. This sent the girl flying backward, crashing into the bystanders, irritating the vice president with such reckless behavior. He was upset that she had believed those words. She shouldn't have let her guard down. Things would always return to normal. Hearing this reprimand, Dawn protested. "I didn't know that was going to happen." Varmint assumed she had been under the effect of stimulants, which had now worn off. He warned her, "Never trust the words of a zombie." The mad scientist was impressed by the creature's ability to launch a surprise attack. Meanwhile, the vice president was genuinely upset. Grinning maliciously, the mad scientist believed this was the most powerful creature he had ever seen. Now, the three humans were terrified, fearing for their lives. Then, something new caught his attention. A new figure had appeared on the battlefield. The two of them locked eyes. But the mad scientist didn't believe this new arrival could pose any real challenge. The problem was, Varmint recognized him immediately. The protagonist asked, "Do you still remember who I am, little Varmint?" Everyone on that street, except for the protagonist, was terrified. The mad scientist, however, didn't understand. Why wasn't his creature moving? Varmint stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. The protagonist questioned him again. "Why did you disobey my orders?" Memories from the past resurfaced. The day an arrogant zombie had entered his territory, That figure had been neither fully human nor fully zombie. With a weak personality, he would never become his subordinate. Dawn had no idea what they were discussing. One of the bystanders noticed something alarming. Varmint had wet himself. Gasoline dripped from his legs and pooled on the ground. Varmint was so terrified, he couldn't speak. The more time passed, more gasoline continued to spill. The mad scientist was furious. He couldn't understand why his creature had stopped attacking. Meanwhile, the protagonist stared at his subordinate with a disappointed expression. Varmint was still too frightened to say a single word. In the past, he had been utterly defeated by the king. His former underlings had been shocked by the battle. Now, the protagonist demanded answers. Why are you so quiet? Taking advantage of the silence, it was his turn to speak. He explained why he should be obeyed. This made Varmint even more terrified. The mad scientist had an absolute meltdown. He couldn't understand why his creature was so afraid. But he didn't know the full story. Varmint had an immortal body, yet he had once been dismembered and hung from a tree for 300 years. Now, frustrated with the fight, the mad scientist tried everything to force his creature to respond to commands. Finally, Varmint spoke. I never forgot the orders I received. The mad scientist's control panel shattered, and Varmint turned and fled. As he ran, he shouted, if anyone wants to fight the king, fight him yourselves. The mad scientist was at a loss for words. Dawn and the stainless steel soldiers were equally speechless. Even the protagonist himself admitted that reaction had been a bit excessive. The battle against the zombies was finally over. This was the first time the mad scientist had lost control of a zombie, but he had plenty more creatures and was willing to use them. Until the professor interrupted. The main human forces were almost at his hideout. Above the city, a helicopter hovered. They could finally reach the underground hideout. The blue-haired woman turned to the spy. She asked, is this the place? The spy confirmed, yes. It has 6 floors and spans 11,000 square meters. Not exactly good news. They would have to search every inch of the hideout. The overconfident samurai declared, sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to use overwhelming force. Then, you lead from the helicopter, straight toward the hideout. Still in the aircraft, the blue-haired woman called him an irresponsible idiot. The faster he fell, the more powerful his attack would be. He didn't care about strategy. He just wanted to prove the sheer strength of his attack. Then, a massive explosion erupted in the city. It was so powerful that it obliterated a huge chunk of the ground. Now, he had access to the underground hideout. Sheathing his sword, he said, this is faster than taking the elevator. The blue-haired woman scoffed. She found his display of strength ridiculous. She told him, you should use your earpiece. You could trigger a trap. The chief corrected her. In the face of absolute power, there is no such thing as a successful trap. Then, he jumped from the helicopter, leaving the 2nd Defense Unit behind with his remaining subordinates. For the blue-haired woman, they're all the same. On the ground, the troops kept advancing. They entered the hideout and searched for any resistance. But in the area they were in, there was no one. The more they searched, the more they realized that the place was empty. Escape wasn't an option. The routes were blocked. They had detection systems so precise that they could even catch a mosquito midair. The blue-haired woman wanted to join the action. She wasn't happy about having to stay behind. Her subordinate tried to calm her down, saying it was an order from their superiors. Still furious, she cursed them, wishing they'd have bad luck. Far away, the professor was safe. Knowing that the humans had entered his old hideout, it was time to execute Plan A. Inside a large containment chamber, the being was stored, the one that was meant to be the zombie king. The samurai picked up the note and began to read. It was a provocation, a challenge to release the zombie king, if you are man enough. He ordered a soldier to blast the glass open, but the chiefs suddenly stopped him. Their mission was to capture people, not to take unnecessary risks. Seeing that plan had failed, the professor's team immediately moved to the next plan. A countdown began. With barely any time to react, a massive explosion erupted. The soldiers did their best to protect themselves. As the smoke cleared, the chief watched carefully. The cocky samurai wasn't impressed by the trap. Then the mad scientist announced, the containment chamber has been opened. The professor smiled. Finally, humanity will meet its end. The dawn of a new species. He wanted his creation to wipe out all life, including his own. The steel samurai waited to see what kind of creature would emerge. He never expected that the zombie king would be just a small child. Both the chief and the steel samurai were confused. The chief warned the samurai to be cautious. It may look fragile, but it could be extremely dangerous. The samurai attacked immediately, but the creature was even faster. The chief was shocked. It's powerful, he confirmed. He immediately ordered everyone to evacuate. The top priority was ensuring that his soldiers escaped. The masses of fools ran desperately toward the exit, but the steel samurai wasn't satisfied with the outcome. He launched another attack. This time, he managed to split the creature in two, literally. Each half of the zombie gave birth to a new one. Of all the possible outcomes, this was the worst. Now, they had 2 creatures to fight, but it didn't take long for them to merge back into one. The small zombie waited, watching how the humans would move. The mad scientist ordered the release of more zombies. This would create enough distraction for them to escape. Following the plan, the hordes of zombies began to flood the city. Both the president and the blue-haired woman watched the chaos unfold. The young officer reported, there are too many of them. The situation is going to get worse soon. He wanted to set up a defensive line, but his commander ordered him to step back and just watch. Loosening her magnificent hair, she said, this is just a warm-up. With her sword in hand, she was ready to start wiping out zombies. With perfect posture, her threatening aura became evident. In the blink of an eye, the blue-haired woman was already engaged in battle. Her strikes were precise, swift, powerful, and so strong that they sent zombies flying. Her strength was incredible. She slashed through a tree trunk, causing it to bend from the force. Using the elastic energy, she propelled herself into the air. Her subordinate couldn't believe what he was seeing. Up above, she glided through the horde, striking down each zombie in her path. Her sword was the first thing to hit the ground. Then, she landed gracefully, balancing perfectly atop the blade. Then, a light drizzle of zombie remains began to fall over the city. The young officer was completely stunned. He never imagined his commander was this strong. Looking at the meal on his plate, he realized something. She was truly amazing. If their enemies wanted to use chaos as a distraction for escape, they needed to rethink that strategy. The mad scientist was frustrated. That crazy woman had eliminated all the zombies they had released. He was certain this wouldn't have happened if they still had the chainsaw zombie. However, more zombies were spreading through the city. Discreetly, two of the protagonist's subordinates watched the movement. They wore masks to protect themselves from the airborne agent that made zombies lose control. The man who looked like a lone shark approached a nearby zombie to ask if he had seen his colleague, but the creature was very rude to him, telling him to get lost. Annoyed, he muttered that the creatures in that place were very unfriendly. Their mission was to find their runaway friend to avoid a possible punishment from the king. In the lowest level of the underground hideout, the so-called strongest zombie remained motionless. The humans looked at the creature with slight apprehension, and the small zombie wanted them to keep playing with him like that. It seemed like some kind of provocation. It ended up working very well. The steel samurai declared that if that little zombie still wanted to play, he was still too soft. With his katana firmly gripped, he didn't hesitate to strike with precision. Once again, he managed to slice the little creature into two pieces. The small pieces bounced on the ground until they merged back together, forming a single body again. The steel samurai was getting tired of this situation. He couldn't stand seeing his enemy constantly running away. He ordered him to man up and engage in a proper fight. It seemed like the little zombie would finally comply. He spit out his pacifier. And then, a metamorphosis began to take place across his entire body. To the human surprise, it now had very interesting attributes, revealing a form they had not expected to see in a zombie. In fact, it was really impressive how much it had managed to change its appearance. It seemed that the zombie was gradually learning how to control this new body. They had no idea how that was even possible. Smiling sweetly at the humans, the transformed zombie hinted that things were about to take a different turn. Using all the charm she had just gained with her transformation, she playfully asked the men to keep playing with her. The steel samurai declared that he would slice her up until nothing was left. He launched one of his most powerful attacks against her, but even at the peak of his strength, it was useless. His blade was stopped with just one of her fingers. He kept pushing against her, but the zombie showed no effort at all. Faced with this problem, he realized that his enemy was much more powerful than he had imagined. Looking back, he called out for the chief to assist him in the battle. Understanding the severity of the situation, the chief was already suited up in his most powerful armor, but he never got the chance to attack. He was suddenly struck by the zombie. He was sent flying hundreds of meters away from that place. The impact was so loud that even the protagonist's zombie subordinates wondered what it was. The same sound was heard by the president on the city's surface. His body had become a projectile, crashing into the top of a building and causing a massive explosion. After that, his body bounced across the city until it finally landed at the feet of the vice president's subordinates. They didn't know what to do with the human. They thought about helping him, but since they were zombies, they decided to leave him as he was. From beneath the city, smoke and debris began to rise. The blue-haired woman noticed that another projectile had been launched. She immediately recognized him. It was the chief of the Stainless Steel Academy. The samurai had been overpowered by his enemy, now barely able to move. Even so, he was doing his best to mumble a few words to his colleagues, and soon they came face to face with that female figure, extremely dangerous. On the other side of the city, a barbecue was being patiently prepared. They said this was the first time they had seen a barbecue being made with eggs as well. The extras were much friendlier now, and one of them had prepared a special tea for the vice president. After tasting it, he remarked that it lacked sweetness. Annoyed, one of the extras wanted to know who had made that tea, because for the vice president, only the best should be served. In the middle of their meal, they heard a high-pitched sound that made them uneasy. The female zombie continued to mock the humans. She took a threatening stance. The president knew that this being was different from the others and could be a major problem for them. The rivals agreed to a temporary truce. It was crucial that they work together at this moment. The zombie's face was now marked with a deep expression of contempt. Dawn felt the explosions coming from the other side of the city. They were getting closer. The vice president decided to take action. He informed her that he was going to check out what was happening. There was no time to waste. The blue-haired woman had already thrown her sword at the enemy. Even though it hit its target, the cut was far too shallow. The president was already on the creature's tail, closing it at high speed. But her attack was intercepted. She was caught off guard by a movement only a ballerina could pull off. As she struggled to recover from the blow, the zombie sneered, saying that kind of speed was far from impressive. The president was ready to counterattack, positioning herself in a way that put her opponent at risk. Her legs swung toward the zombie's head like a scythe. This time, she managed to make contact. The zombie smirked, saying it was truly pathetic how little strength she had. The president backed away to give her colleague room to strike with slashing attacks, but not a single one managed to land on the creature's body. From a distance, the steel samurai watched the destruction caused by the fight between the three of them. He'd hoped they could hold the creature off for a little longer. All he needed was just 2 more minutes, because now he was about to activate his emergency armor. And as if he were the main character in some generic tokusatsu series, he began suiting up. The zombie looked at him with great interest, clearly enjoying what she was seeing. And to be honest, he really did look like he had stepped straight out of a Gundam series. His powerful form was called Heart of Steel, and he was using its first version. The president was annoyed by this, realizing that the creature was ignoring them. They took advantage of the distraction to launch a combined attack against the zombie, who barely moved. Ignoring women awakens a violent reflex in them, and that was exactly what the zombie had provoked. But before they could land a blow, she revealed something unexpected. A massive tongue. It was merely a distraction for both women, as her transformation was still in progress, changing her entire body. The shockwave from the blow she delivered to the ground sent both women flying. What was once a woman had now transformed into a figure very familiar with Trembolone. Not clad in Heart of Steel, the samurai was convinced he could do something. The women were in shock. They had known that the zombie was capable of transforming. Frightened by what they were witnessing, they no longer knew if they could win this battle. The hulking zombie and the steel samurai, now in one of the coolest cosplays ever, were on a collision course. Facing each other, they decided that this fight would be settled with a single attack. Immediately, both of them prepared to end everything with one strike. But the zombie's strength far surpassed his. The clash between them sent a massive shockwave of destruction through the battlefield. The women nearby could do nothing to stop it. Coincidentally, the vice president and Dawn had just arrived at the site of the action. Through the smoke, a silhouette could be seen. Unfortunately, the armor was more stylish than functional. The steel samurai had lost part of his body. The bulked-up zombie mocked him, declaring that he had lost. It seemed the samurai assumed this was a rhetorical statement, even with half his torso missing. He claimed he was still in the fight. Apparently, he would only admit defeat once he no longer existed. Dawn looked around at the destruction, wondering if they were even in the right place. She had no idea what was happening. The protagonist noticed a very familiar scent in the air. The creature showed a rare hint of empathy toward the samurai and decided to reveal her true power, hoping he would finally give up. He definitely hadn't expected the zombie to be capable of getting even stronger. Her back muscles started growing at an absurd rate. Her hair lifted into the air. It was almost like she was going Super Saiyan. To everyone's surprise, she now looked like a generic manhwa character. Even the women weren't prepared for this. The scientists had no control over her in this form, but the professor simply said, "She is the Zombie King." This was expected. The creature announced that there was no reason to continue the battle, but the samurai was too proud to accept that. The women also closed in, preparing to attack her together. Smirking, the zombie warned them that quick attacks were useless. All it took was a simple flick of her finger, and the armless samurai was sent flying. Everyone was blasted away, and the samurai lost his armor completely. The force of the impact shattered all the windows in the nearest building. As they were hurled into the distance, the women tried to recover somehow. Thanks to the power of plot convenience, they landed right next to the vice president. He caught them in his arms, preventing them from suffering further injuries. Dawn was horrified. She never imagined that both presidents could be defeated so easily. The Steel extras were also worried about what had happened to their leader. Being the generic proud warrior, he claimed he could still fight. The zombie grinned, saying that he had allowed them to live, yet they were still acting so stubbornly. Exhausted, Violet warned them. This was the Zombie King. It was better to flee immediately. The blue-haired woman reinforced her warning, leaving Dawn terrified. The Zombie King pointed at the humans, commanding his minions to attack. A horde of undead outcasts rushed forward with fury. The extras were terrified. Not only did they have no idea where all those creatures had come from, but they also couldn't do anything about it. The blue-haired woman urged the vice president to order everyone to leave, or that place would become their grave. The zombies were charging forward, ravenous. Meanwhile, the professor was delighted by the sheer magnitude of the Zombie King's power. The protagonist dropped the two women to the ground, feeling disrespected by what he had just heard. The blue-haired woman was a bit surprised by his reaction. Then he let out a powerful roar, commanding the creatures to disappear immediately. That alone was enough to halt their advance entirely. The creatures froze around him, incapable of disobeying his command. It was as if they instinctively knew that before them stood a truly supreme existence. Even the one who called himself the true Zombie King was stunned by what was happening. Now he was intrigued by this mysterious figure. That made the protagonist lose control of his emotions once again. Walking over the zombies as if they were mere stepping stones, he demanded to know what title he should claim for himself, since an imposter had already called himself king. An eerie silence fell over the entire city, and the poor zombies instinctively stepped aside to clear a path for the protagonist. The armless samurai could barely process what he was witnessing. Meanwhile, as the protagonist approached his enemy, he noted that he was strangely silent. He positioned himself atop the mountain of corpses. The creature gazed up at him, puzzled. The protagonist then mockingly asked if a cat had stolen his tongue. The armless samurai was utterly dumbfounded by what he was seeing. Dawn, on the other hand, was shocked. This was the protagonist's true appearance. With a subtle smirk, the Zombie King finally understood his enemy was also a zombie. Realizing this himself, the armless samurai demanded to know how the Academy of the Beyond allowed a zombie to become vice president. Violet immediately told him to shut up. The two mighty beings stared each other down. They had decided. the one who survived this battle would be the true king. Both were ready to engage in a ferocious fight. The wicked creature landed a direct hit on the protagonist, but the vice president only scoffed at him, taunting that he must not have eaten anything today. It took the zombie king a moment to realize that his enemy was truly powerful. He then received a devastating punch. The sheer shockwave from the blow sent the zombies beneath them flying. The creature's bodies illuminated the night sky. Meanwhile, the false zombie king was only stopped from flying away himself because he had no wings. His body kept soaring across the city. The distance he covered with just one punch was unbelievable. He was launched so far away that he left the continent and crashed into the ocean. His impact was so violent that he slammed into a battleship, throwing the entire crew into chaos. The shockwaves shook the vessel as the creature struggled to regain his bearings. Watching the battle, the mad professor was completely baffled. He had no idea how this was even possible. They never knew that guy was a zombie too. Despite the brutal impact, the attack hadn't done enough damage to finish him. The scientists couldn't even measure the potential of this new combatant. Meanwhile, the zombie king suddenly began lifting the entire battleship with his bare hands. Dawn became alarmed. She had just noticed something even more dangerous falling from the sky. A submarine was hurled into the middle of the city, and the zombie king grinned, declaring that he was in fact full energy. The destruction in the city was reaching catastrophic levels. Shaking with fear, Dawn muttered that it would be best to leave this place immediately. Elsewhere, the lone shark-looking zombie was repairing the steel samurai's body. His friend scolded him, telling him to stop welding immediately. He turned around and did as he was told. The chief was furious. Those buffoons had welded what should have been cut and cut what should have been welded. Looking toward the horizon, they felt the overwhelming presence of the true king. Meanwhile, the battle in the city continued in full force. The protagonist gained the high ground, positioning himself above his adversary. He began mocking him, trying to provoke him. Dawn remained terrified, still shaken by the vice president's true form. Something was approaching rapidly. The protagonist maneuvered a cord in his hands, wrapping it tightly around the zombie king's neck. This way, he had his enemy exactly where he wanted him. The armless samurai was still struggling to accept that this being was a zombie. Meanwhile, the vice president refused to let his enemy run away. The moment he reeled him in, he landed a crushing blow, and from the way the impact felt, his boot soles must have been soaked in lemon juice. The force of the kick sent his enemy flying into the stratosphere. He thought he could also play with the rope, but as soon as he tried to pull it, the protagonist cut it. The creature plummeted from the sky like a missile, crashing into the city. The extras watched everything like spectators at an event. Meanwhile, the protagonist seemed to be having a lot of fun with all of it. His enemy tried to attack him at an incredible speed. He claimed he wasn't trying to run away, he just wanted to change the battlefield. Now the two of them were much closer to the ocean. The protagonist had landed on one of the aircraft carriers. Some of the crew members noticed what happened, assuming he was just an ordinary person. Looking at his opponent, he remarked how much he seemed to enjoy throwing things around. Now the crew members started to panic, realizing that this was a zombie. Some of them considered abandoning the ship. The false king then said that he also liked throwing things. Back in the city, the chief was observing the fight alongside two of the king's subordinates. He said they should flee immediately. He knew the vice president was strong, but they shouldn't underestimate the mad professor. The lone shark-looking zombie told the human to shut up. He should be paying attention to what was happening. There was no existence that could defeat their king. Not even a god would be able to accomplish that. The protagonist, who had been on the aircraft carrier, suddenly vanished. He reappeared right in front of his opponent. The false king realized that he had become even faster. Then he was brutally struck in the face. The impact was so powerful that it launched him out of Earth's orbit. He soared through space until he realized that he was no longer on Earth. And then he noticed a massive object heading straight for him. A full-size ship had been thrown at him. The gigantic aircraft carrier crashed into the zombie, burying him into the moon. Back on Earth, nobody could explain how any of this was happening. How was he so strong? Why was physics completely ignored? The protagonist was now sitting in a lifeboat. Meanwhile, the moon now had an aircraft carrier stuck to it. There was no point in trying to run anymore. Anywhere they went would be just as dangerous. The furious creature declared that this wasn't over. It began using all of its strength to break free from the aircraft carrier. After finally shaking it off, it used the moon to propel itself back toward Earth, and the protagonist was just waiting for it to get closer. Preparing himself for a jump, he began gathering his strength. Now he was also heading into space. He had to use the aircraft carrier to keep gaining momentum and return to Earth. The battle between the monsters was far from over. Knowing that the ship contained a nuclear reactor, the creature rushed toward it. Destroying part of its structure, he wanted the protagonist to experience its destructive power. The ship that had once been floating in Earth's orbit was now plummeting toward the ground. The impact created a massive explosion. Everyone watching the battle was utterly terrified. A shockwave of the explosion started tearing apart everything around it. It was so massive that it could be seen from multiple locations on the planet. Its mushroom cloud rose far beyond the clouds. The protagonist's friends and the humans all scrambled for shelter from the approaching shockwave. He stood on another ship preparing to close in on his enemy. His jump was so forceful that it made the entire vessel shake. And now, the creature realized that he was once again face to face with his enemy. Observing him closely, the protagonist figured that his adversary wanted more, because he was just getting started. After everything that had happened, the protagonist was finally starting to grow concerned. Meanwhile, the creature made a proposition. It believed that this was a battle with no winners. They should stop fighting immediately. Instead, they should work together to destroy the world. As he spoke, he hurled the protagonist's body across the city. He proposed that they divide the world in half, each ruling over their own side while avoiding each other. Dawn was a little worried about that last attack. Meanwhile, the creature wanted to know the protagonist's opinion. The protagonist had no interest in destroying the world. Watching the fight, the chief said that none of this made sense, which in his opinion was reason enough to flee immediately. The two were far too strong. They should retreat, recover their strength, and plan a counterattack. But the lung shark-looking zombie told him to shut up. He talked too much nonsense. He was completely mistaken if he thought that the true king was limited to just one transformation. The expression of disbelief on the chief's face was unmistakable. With a mocking smirk, the protagonist declared that it wasn't worth working with such a creature. He was deeply offended by the idea of dividing everything in half. The chief continued to watch the fight, still in awe of what was happening. In a threatening tone, the protagonist stated that only the weak talk about destruction or absolute control. Dawn wanted to know what they were saying, but they were too far away to be heard. The protagonist was now truly enraged by the creature before him. And by the looks of it, this so-called king would only learn after receiving a proper lesson. The protagonist's face began to change, gaining color. As his appearance transformed, his power also surged. Observing the change, the women were completely shocked. The once gray-skinned being had now turned into a normal person. Was it really possible that he had transformed again? The protagonist now had a human appearance, but a rather generic one. His eyes strongly resembled those of a certain character from a story where the protagonist eliminated people by writing their names in a notebook. His menacing aura could be felt from miles away. On board the ship, the false king felt terrified. Meanwhile, back with the protagonist's subordinates, the chief was with them. One of them hurriedly woke him up, telling him to see for himself what was happening. He needed to witness with his own eyes the being they called their god. Even though the protagonist still had long nails, he had turned into a normal human. No one could explain why he now had a fully human body. As the battle raged on, rain began to pour from the sky, and the false king grew even more frustrated, unable to comprehend what kind of existence stood before him. It was impossible for someone to be both a zombie and a human at the same time. His attack was just about to strike the face of this new entity, but the protagonist did nothing, until suddenly, even the raindrops stopped moving. All he had to do was raise one hand. And just like that, the so-called zombie king's body was lifted into the air. Finally, the raindrops began moving again, but in reverse, rising toward the sky. People, too, were caught in this gravity inversion. Dawn tried to hold onto something to keep from floating away, wondering if a zombie should even have this much power. Even the massive warships weren't spared from this force. Even the sea creatures began rising out of the ocean. It was a terrifying sight. The completely subdued creature still glared defiantly at its opponent. Once he was close enough, the protagonist told him that from now on, he should call him Daddy. Even from space, one could see the cataclysm taking shape. Dawn finally realized that this was a massive tornado. The presidents crashed to the ground. The fish that had been flung into the air also started falling back down. Recovering from the impact, Violet stated that no zombie should be capable of all this. A gigantic whale crashed onto the rooftop of a building. Everything was so absurd that even the mad professor was stunned. In his paperweight-like state, the false zombie king had no idea how this was possible. The mad scientists had never seen anything like this in their entire lives. Without arms, the creature struggled to get up, and in doing so, he took the most difficult path possible. But thanks to his regenerative abilities, his arms began to regrow. He claimed that everything being done to him was completely useless. After all, he couldn't be killed. Even if he was sliced into thousands of tiny pieces, he could still regenerate. The protagonist took that statement as a personal challenge. With a swift movement of his hand, he pulled the creature's body toward him, grabbing it by the throat with one hand. The creature thrashed desperately, but the protagonist simply smiled at him. He told him that he had completely misunderstood the concept of death, because one didn't have to destroy a body to make someone experience it. The tighter his grip became, the more his senses faded, until the only thing left for him to see was the deep, piercing gaze of the protagonist. Beyond Earth's atmosphere, massive vessels floated in space. They appeared to be designed for interstellar travel. Meanwhile, tornadoes raged across the entire ocean. At last, the false king realized that this being was far more ancient than he had ever imagined. There were those who came from very distant eras. A great war was being fought, and those powerful constructions were ready for battle. They had already withstood over 1,000 sieges, and this was the 6th time humanity had been wiped out. Even so, the protagonist's strength could not be stopped. All those spacecraft were completely destroyed. To his power, they were nothing. Upon gaining access to these memories, the creature began to lose its mind. And in its last moment of lucidity, all it saw were dark, abyssal eyes. Its body was now completely motionless, and from the expression on its face, it was as if its consciousness was no longer there. Still holding the lifeless creature in his hand, the babble seemed to finally reach a conclusion. Those who witnessed everything had no idea what had happened. The protagonist casually dropped the zombie. Its body plummeted toward the ground. It landed completely lifeless, revealing itself to be nothing more than an empty shell. The chief was curious. He didn't understand why the creature wasn't moving anymore. The lung shark chuckled, saying that it must have literally died of fear. The chief wasn't even aware that was possible. On the mad scientists' side, they were also in complete disbelief. This shouldn't have been possible. It was time for them to get to the helicopter. The entire fleet along this coast had been destroyed. This was their only chance to escape. It was now or never. The mad scientist attempted to flee but was immediately frozen in shock. The most powerful being of all was already standing right beside them. They had never revealed their actual position. There was no way he should have found them. With his generic yet terrifying gaze, the protagonist said nothing. He simply observed as those around him trembled with fear. They wanted to know if they would surrender willingly or if they preferred to suffer the same fate as the zombie king. They got a whole second to decide. Everyone immediately chose to surrender, except for the mad professor, who still resisted. The protagonist then gazed at him more seriously, and just like that, the man who should have been executed ended up being captured alive. The others still didn't know what was wrong with him. He was acting very different. Returning to his normal form, he admitted that his transformation was terrifying, but he preferred being a kind and gentle person. Violet suggested that Dawn go ask him about it, but she was also too afraid of the vice president. So Violet encouraged her, saying that one day they would probably make her the vice president of the zombies anyway. Nervous but determined, Dawn approached him and asked if he was okay, since they were about to leave. He stood up, saying he was hungry. This scared her so much that she almost jumped back. But at that moment, what he truly wanted was just a more durable shirt. With that, she realized he was back to being his usual calm self. She asked if he remembered anything, and he said he did, but his memories were a bit hazy. He had lost his sense of time but was certain that he had faced many zombies like that one before. However, since they were all too weak, he never bothered remembering each of those encounters. Inside the prison transport vehicle, the mad scientist wanted to know what the professor was thinking. The professor smiled. He never expected that such a powerful being could exist, but he was certain that he would eventually obtain a sample of its genes and create an even stronger entity. The zombie king had been defeated and Professor Jamie was finally in custody. With that, the protagonist was thrust into the spotlight. People wanted him to become a president as well. He would need to manage and protect his cities. If he failed to expand his population, he would lose the title. He chose City H, even though it was completely abandoned. This worried his superiors, who assumed he would lose his position quickly. But the protagonist was unwavering. He was determined to govern that place. After the formalities were settled, he was officially declared a president. A supervisor was furious about his decision to choose a deserted city and an idiot to lead it. Even Violet recognized that it was a risky choice. The protagonist's subordinates began moving to their new city. The scene was unprecedented. Human soldiers were actively helping zombies relocate to their new home. Alongside the new president was the elite of his subordinates. The lone shark confirmed that everything had been done as ordered. All citizens had been transferred. And that was exactly what he wanted. Asking the soldiers to stand in formation, a tiny zombie flinched. He still wasn't used to humans, believing that they might be dangerous. The soldier reassured him, saying that the president's orders were like the commands of a god, and the president's people were his people too. The little zombies struggled to believe those words. But finally, after so long, they had a place to call home. Sometimes, for a race to thrive, war isn't necessary. Indeed, besides being powerful, the protagonist was an extremely wise being. They wanted to know what should be done with Varmint, as he had already been hanging there as punishment for several months. But the protagonist stated that he should remain there. His place of punishment was atop the City Hall building. At the top of the building, he was properly restrained, constantly crying, acknowledging that he was wrong. Repeatedly pleading for mercy, he swore he would be obedient from now on. He didn't want to become zombie jerky. The citizens were overjoyed with the changes, finally having a home of their own. Meanwhile, Violet was training hard, determined to grow stronger, but she ended up crashing violently into a wall. She tried to recover from the powerful impact. After getting back on her feet, she coughed heavily. She had no idea how this could even be possible. On the other side of the battlefield stood Dawn, who had undergone a staggering power boost. Seeing this firsthand, Violet realized there was nothing she could do. This was power beyond what could be surpassed. It was as if Dawn had two completely different personalities. As Violet watched her closely, the smile on Dawn's face reflected a clear shift in her demeanor. Dawn declared that she could still fight. Violet, determined to improve, launched herself at incredible speed. She maneuvered to get behind her friend, but she was suddenly caught off guard by Dawn's completely unnatural head movement, something no normal human would do. This bizarre sight shocked the president, forcing her to abort her attack. She asked if Dawn was still human, but the shock made her forget about that for now. They were still sparring and Dawn launched an aggressive assault. Violet quickly switched to evasive maneuvers, dodging the gunfire. Dawn's machine gun was singing like it was on a live TV show. Dawn boasted that she was now strong enough to become a president herself. Then she started laughing sadistically, her machine gun still roaring. After dodging for a long time, Violet finally found cover. But it was clear that she was reaching her limit. Her frustration was only surpassed by the anger she felt toward herself. Determined to push forward, she demanded that Dawn show her strongest technique now. This triggered the zombie cells in Dawn's body, activating at full power. Violet rushed in, executing one of her best attacks. But Dawn mocked her, questioning if she was even trying. She wouldn't use her best technique against such a weak opponent. Then, in a terrifyingly unpredictable move, the president struck with precision. A clean cut severed Dawn's body in two. Despite the pain and the damage, all Dawn did was smile. Violet, stunned, questioned why her friend hadn't even tried to dodge. She was completely shaken by that insane regeneration ability. Dawn's genes were now practically invisible. For Violet, this was too much. She demanded to know what the zombie had done to her. Almost revealing her genes, Dawn asked if Violet finally understood that she could be a president too. She lunged at Violet with her bare hands, preparing to land a precise strike. This time, Violet couldn't dodge. She was slammed against the wall. That was enough for her. She suggested they stop the training. Dawn's body began emitting white smoke. As she returned to her normal self, she apologized, saying she hadn't done any of that on purpose. Violet wanted to know if she really wasn't a zombie, even after being bitten. Dawn explained that she had undergone multiple tests in the lab, and they confirmed she was still human. But that still didn't explain her extreme regeneration or the unnatural way she moved her head. Dawn felt she could transform whenever she wanted, yet she didn't feel any different physically. And whenever she felt exhausted, she could take stimulants without suffering any side effects. Hearing this, Violet's expression turned into pure frustration. She demanded that Dawn move out of her way. She had something important to do. Dawn asked where she was going, but Violet told her it wasn't her business. Another subordinate also asked where she was headed. Violet was already rushing towards City Edge, the protagonist's territory. She boarded a plane in a hurry. The aircraft took off, heading straight for the city. Finally, the plane landed at the airport. The president disembarked in a panic, ignoring her subordinate entirely. Outside the City Hall building, everything was running as usual. The protagonist was assigning different districts to his subordinates. Finally, it was time to assign a role to the lone shark-looking guy. He was ready to serve loyally and irresponsibly. It was no surprise that he looked like a lone shark. The protagonist saw potential in him to manage the city's treasury, making him responsible for all the money. The meeting room door suddenly swung open. Recognizing Violet, the protagonist asked what brought her there. The woman hurriedly approached him. The timing was perfect, as he had planned to report the city's situation to her. But instead, Violet forcibly grabbed his mouth, making him bite her arm. Thanking him for what he had done, she told him he could do whatever he wanted with the city. Now she was already outside, heading back to her own city. On her way out of City Hall, she ran into her subordinate. He was concerned about the bite, worried she might now be under his control. If the protagonist ever decided to betray humanity, they would be in serious trouble. But the idea of gaining all that strength and regeneration ability was far too tempting. It was worth the risk. She didn't even care if she had to dance for him. Meanwhile, in the meeting room, the protagonist was trying to figure out what had just happened. After assigning roles to his subordinates, the city slowly began to flourish. There was now a clothing store for zombies. There were barbers. There were janitors all over the city and even furniture brokers. A driving school had been established to teach zombies how to drive vehicles. Even though zombies weren't exactly used to those things. From his office in City Hall, he watched the city's progress. It gave him an incredible sense of fulfillment. Meanwhile, his file was being reviewed by the supervisor. She was not impressed by this new president's credentials. She couldn't understand what had motivated the Academy of the Beyond to appoint him. Soon, she learned that he was also a zombie, or at least, that's what the president of the Academy of Stainless Steel claimed. But she assumed it was just slander, as rival academies often spread false rumors about one another. Regardless, she didn't like this new president. She doubted he had the necessary personality for the job. Zombie or not, she would check for herself in person. Meanwhile, at the North Pole, an expedition was underway. A helicopter was approaching its landing site. In the middle of the sea, a massive ship was breaking through the ice. A man greeted Professor Strange. It seemed they had discovered the remains of an ancient civilization, a dried-up body that was thousands of years old. They made the discovery while conducting some experiments. The body was buried under 500 meters of ice. The professor stressed the importance of being careful. They couldn't afford to damage it. If it really belonged to an ancient civilization, this would be one of the greatest discoveries in human history. Slowly, the ice block was being carefully removed. The professor hoped this would be a major breakthrough for technological advancements. Among them, there were a few suspicious-looking individuals, their faces hidden beneath hoods. As the president of the Department of Archaeology, this was the first time he had ever felt so nervous about his work. The crane finally lifted the block of ice. It was carefully lowered to the ground. Inside, a human silhouette could be seen. It was clearly a female figure, and despite being severely dried up, she had immense potential. Staring at her, the professor couldn't believe it was real. He was completely mesmerized. Distracted, one of the team members was suddenly attacked, a bite to the neck. While he was being feasted on, the man next to him demanded to know who was responsible. The professor realized these people were not part of his team. Panic broke out. They began screaming for help, but there was little they could do. The professor was thrown to the ground by one of the mysterious figures. They declared that he was merely a necessary sacrifice. They told him to stop struggling. They only needed a bit of his life juice. These strange figures had unusually long canines, and they enjoyed biting necks. The block of ice fell to the ground. Immediately, one of the men began smashing it open. It didn't take long before they reached the dried-up body inside. She was almost completely free from her frozen prison. Once liberated, they covered the woman with a coat. After so long, she was finally free. Her subordinates saluted her. They hailed the Blood Queen. They wished her a long life and eternal youth, and her first question to them was simple. Is that accursed zombie still alive? The Blood Queen gazed toward the horizon. His subordinates informed her that the zombie was still alive, even after a millennium. But for some reason, after destroying human civilization, he aligned himself with them and was now rebuilding his clan. One of the women urged the queen to be cautious, but in her eyes there was immense hatred and resentment. She was determined not to lose to him again. Back at the headquarters, everything was going smoothly. The zombies were enjoying their lives, drinking delicious tea, until one of them was informed that someone had come to visit. At the headquarters, all those interested in the new president had gathered. The man who had been bitten earlier was writhing in immense pain. No one had ever seen anything like it before. It didn't look like a bite from a zombie. They knew he had been on the archaeological expedition and his team was now missing. Even though he was just an ordinary person, he had managed to injure 2 presidents. It seemed they needed a professional opinion on the matter. A heavily armored vehicle parked in front of the building. Inside it was the protagonist. The soldiers saluted him instantly. He was still not used to it. Then he was led inside the building to examine the case. Several well-drawn side characters were already waiting for him. The first one stepped forward to welcome him. That president belonged to the Academy of Iron. He was very excited to meet the man responsible for capturing the mad scientist. After greeting him, he went on his way. Apparently, that side character was extremely envious, assuming the protagonist was just a nobody. Meanwhile, a zombie was delighted to shake hands with humans. Another foolish character scoffed, saying he could tell just by looking that the protagonist was weak. At the same time, the Iron Samurai wondered if these side characters had a death wish. After making this remark, he suddenly realized the Iron Samurai had disappeared. Wisely, he decided to hide. He hadn't expected the zombie to be coming. The doctor asked the zombie to take a look at the case, hoping he might recognize the type of monster. But the zombie barely even knew his own age. How was he supposed to know what kind of creature it was? However, he noticed very peculiar markings on the man's neck. It unlocked a distant memory in his mind. A bit nervous, Violet asked if he had figured something out. The man was becoming increasingly aggressive. Then he finally realized who he was dealing with. The first rule of being a scoundrel is to be smart. It ensures longevity. The protagonist became extremely excited by this discovery. He knew that the man belonged to the Blood Tribe. A massive energy surge radiated from his hand, so powerful that it sent shockwaves throughout the room. The vampire, who had been acting aggressively, instantly curled into the fetal position, trembling in fear. The humans were sent flying across the room. Even the foolish side character wasn't spared. No one knew what had caused that sudden explosion. Something was happening. On the other hand, the girls were already accustomed to this kind of situation. Staring at the creature, the protagonist was certain he had wiped them off the face of the earth long ago. But clearly, he had been wrong. He wanted to know where that little girl who loved to poison him was. The vampire insisted he knew nothing. He had only been in this form for a day and desperately wanted to be spared. Finally, the zombie's energy stabilized. The other presidents were starting to have second thoughts about their initial impressions of the zombie. Meanwhile, the Iron Samurai was regretting not staying home. The worst of the tension had passed and the zombie had truly returned to normal. The girls approached him, eager to know if he had discovered anything. They wanted to know what the Blood Tribe was exactly. The protagonist warned them to be extra cautious in the coming days. His expression turned deadly serious, as if he was about to reveal something crucial. The girls braced themselves for a revelation that could change their lives. Then the protagonist said he had forgotten what he was about to say. Violet was furious at that unnecessary tension. She assumed that every time he transformed, his brain weakened. He tried to defend himself, saying he would remember soon. The other presidents now believed he really was weak. Hearing this, the protagonist shot them a sideways glance, which almost made them ruin their underwear. Meanwhile, in an abandoned city, the vampires were showing the Blood Queen their new home. Seeing that they basically lived on the streets, she was absolutely disgusted. Their living conditions were so pitiful that they even received alms without asking. The passersby couldn't understand why beggars were on these streets. After all, the government-managed cities were well maintained. One of the queen's subordinates saw the small amount of money and was overjoyed, which only infuriated her even more. She didn't understand why she had been revived, knowing they were in a completely vulnerable situation. The girl stated that the last millennium had been incredibly difficult to survive. Ever since the zombie turned her into a dried husk, all they could do was watch from afar. After that, he started exterminating vampires. They had to do whatever it took to survive. To stay away from the zombie, they had to pretend to be dead. And because of his existence, they had been hiding for the past 1,000 years. No matter where they were in the world, they hid from both humans and the zombie. They had been living this way for so long that her friend had turned into a complete idiot. The queen declared that reviving her had been pointless. Back then, she was already no match for him, so there was no chance she would be now. Then the idiot finally spoke up, saying they had revived her because they had obtained a crucial piece of information. They had heard about someone who could make her invincible. The girl confirmed that it was true. Now the queen was interested. She wanted to know who this person was. "It's that man," the idiot said, showing her a photo of the mad professor. Inside the headquarters, the humans were still gathered. They had gone to see the mad professor, who remained completely restrained. To the zombie, it would be better if the prisoner wasn't alive anymore. But Violet argued that they needed to uncover more about his hidden experiments. Not to mention, the professor still had many spies. The protagonist stated that the professor could easily escape from this prison. A poorly informed side character scoffed, claiming it was impossible, as the professor was under extremely tight security. Since it was the zombie who had captured him, they decided to take him on a tour of the facility. The prison had been built especially to contain him. The depth of the facility was 3 kilometers underground. It had 1,500 floors and 100,000 armed guards. Even with an elevator, it took half an hour to reach the lowest level. Not to mention the wide variety of weaponry in place. But that was just the beginning. There was a president assigned to every 100 floors, totaling 30. Additionally, there were 2 exclusive warden presidents overseeing the entire prison. With this level of security, and escape was unimaginable. To top it all off, there was a massive bomb installed in the facility. The professor was physically attached to the detonator. Even if he were freed, the explosion would completely erase him from existence. Even a god wouldn't survive such an explosion. It seemed like the protagonist was slightly impressed, but in reality, he found humans to be a bit too paranoid. He was almost embarrassed for them. They were way too ridiculous. In a dark alley near the prison, the Blood Queen was also watching the facility. She was shocked by the level of security. "Humans are such hateful creatures," she muttered. Meanwhile, a side character told the president that an inspector was heading to the protagonist's city. She should inform her boyfriend. She immediately denied that they were dating. She also didn't understand why she was being told this. The inspector was informed that the city was full of zombies, but the side character wasn't concerned. To him, the only thing that mattered was absolute strength. After hearing that, the president made a peculiar expression. She realized that this fool would soon learn how things really worked. That particular city was very well structured. The zombie was surprised by how prosperous human cities had become. Meanwhile, the mad professor remained in his unbreakable prison. Inside the prison, a man was on his way to deliver food to the professor. One of the scientists believed that there was no hope left for them, but the professor still desperately wanted the zombies' genes. This terrified his subordinate. He was convinced that they would all be executed soon, but the professor was confident. As long as the humans didn't have access to his research, they wouldn't get rid of him. He had already ordered his spies to store all the important data somewhere, even he didn't know where. He was determined to make these fools regret leaving him alive. The zombie was too strong for them to extract a genetic sample. It was probably impossible to create anything stronger than him. But to the professor, that didn't matter. He only needed to find a test subject that was already powerful. That would make his work much easier. However, there was one problem. This was a maximum security prison. The scientists had no idea how they would escape. The professor fell silent because he already knew what was happening. The food delivery robot was approaching them. It was small, moving very slowly. It was so cautious that it almost seemed suspicious. Even the robot itself seemed hesitant. Watching this scene, the mad scientist was completely confused. But the professor casually swallowed a bite of food. A tiny probe had been hidden in one of his teeth, and he continued acting like nothing had happened. He was secretly communicating with the spy, wanting to know where the zombie king's body was. He learned that it was being stored in a laboratory on the 200th floor of the prison, guarded by 2 wardens. The body remained completely unresponsive. The professor ordered his spy to continue following his instructions. Meanwhile, in the city, the zombie was joyfully strolling through the streets when his phone rang. It was Violet. She informed him that an inspector was on her way to his city and would be arriving any moment now. That auditor's job was to evaluate the citizens' quality of life and lifestyle. If she found out that he was a zombie, he would be immediately fired. Extremely anxious, he asked if she would believe him if he simply claimed to be human. Violet scolded him, reminding him that his entire city was full of zombies. She urged him to do something about it immediately. After hanging up, he was covered in fear. He imagined that everything was already over. He had no idea what to do and no clue what was even within his power. Then, as he looked into a shop window, something caught his attention. Inside, there were tons of makeup supplies. The inspector arrives. The inspector finally landed at the airport. A plane was already prepared to take her to City Ish. Her biggest concern was the weak personality of this new president. That's why she was eager to fire him. Meanwhile, in the city, to the president's surprise, several vehicles suddenly started falling from the sky. This unusual sight was the work of the protagonist. His subordinates were curious about what he was up to. Those trucks were packed with makeup. It was meant to be used to disguise the citizens since an inspector was on the way. Realizing the urgency of the situation, the lone shark immediately started organizing teams to ensure the task was completed on time. This was crucial if they wanted to continue living in the city. The trucks carrying makeup were quickly dispatched to different districts. Some zombies were skeptical about whether this strategy would actually work, but the lone shark never questioned his king's orders. He was certain there was a reason behind this madness. Immediately, all the zombies got to work. A young child asked what was going on. His mother explained that the king wanted them to disguise themselves as humans. She walked over to a distribution point and picked up some makeup. Her young son was very excited about the task. After asking him to wait a moment, she transformed completely. Citywide makeover. Finally, all the makeup was distributed. Of course, some zombies struggled with their disguises. They pointed out that Goo's disguise wasn't very convincing. The zombie snapped back, saying it wasn't their business. Those 2 specific cases were going to be a problem. The solution? They turned them into dogs. Meanwhile, the inspector should have already arrived. The 2 zombies didn't like their new dog disguises, but the lone shark reminded them that when they were alive, that's exactly what they were. The inspector's deception. Finally, the inspector's plane landed. But what the zombies didn't know was that she had actually arrived in the city by train instead. She deliberately avoided her official transport, believing that her travel information had been leaked. By arriving this way, she could investigate more effectively. A bias against the new president. One of the side characters wanted to know why she hated the new president so much. Apparently, she believed he was weak and unqualified. Besides, very few people ever impressed her. And in this particular case, she was already biased against him. Overhearing the conversation, she asked what was wrong with having an opinion in advance. Ever since the High Superintendent abandoned his authority, she believed that any random fool could become president. She firmly believed that only the Superintendent could lead humanity toward a prosperous and glorious future. Back in the city, the protagonist continued eating his meal of eggs. Now that the inspector had arrived, it was time to get to work. As they discussed the matter, a side character mentioned that it had been a long time since they had seen the high superintendent. He had gone off on an expedition and was expected to return soon. At the airport, the city's team was still waiting for the inspector's arrival. They started finding her delay suspicious but decided to keep waiting. The first inspections begin. Two of the inspector's assistants headed to a store to begin the evaluation process. There, they noticed something unusual. Every single product in the store was made from eggs. This deeply disturbed one of them. He declared he couldn't even bear to look at or hear about eggs, which confused the inspector since that man was blind and deaf. Interviewing the citizens, meanwhile, another assistant interviewed a citizen about the Zombie King's administration. He asked if the citizen had ever had any complaints. The citizen replied that the king was wonderful. He gives free houses and eggs. Right in the middle of the interview, the citizen's arm suddenly fell off. This was definitely not something the inspector had expected. He panicked, deeply concerned about the man's condition. But the citizen simply picked up his arm and walked away. He casually explained that it was just a prosthetic and that the inspector shouldn't worry. Still, the assistant remained extremely confused. They couldn't find a single sane person in the entire city. It was the first time the inspector had dealt with such ridiculous humans. It was almost as if they were zombies. She started assuming that the Zombie King had built a city for weirdos and lunatics. A dangerous meal. Meanwhile, the Zombie King was staring at something atop a building. One of his soldiers noticed that something was off. Another subordinate asked what was wrong. He explained that the king had been acting strangely ever since he ate. He was mumbling things and trembling. His assistant asked if there was something unusual about the food. The soldier wasn't sure. All he knew was that the president was hungry, so they decided to make some spicy scrambled eggs for him. That was a big mistake. The king absolutely couldn't eat that kind of food. The soldier, confused, asked why. Then he learned the terrifying truth. Spicy food triggers his uncontrollable mode, and once activated, he remains in that state for at least a month. Spreading the bad news. This needed to be reported immediately. He called Blackie and explained the situation. At first, Blackie was confused. They had already banned all spicy food from the city. He had no idea how this had happened. Unfortunately, the lone shark was just as clueless. Now, everyone was on edge. The guy who looked like Piccolo speculated that the king might exterminate the inspection team. And honestly, that was a real possibility. The inspection team's journey continues. Since there wasn't much else to see at their current location, the inspection team decided to move on. That's when they noticed a strange object in the sky. It was a truck. It crashed near them, sending debris flying everywhere. Moments later, the Zombie King himself arrived. The inspectors were baffled. There wasn't supposed to be a truck there. Now, standing before them, the president seemed excited. He declared that he would personally take the inspector on a tour of his city. The inspection team struggled to recover from the shockwave. They had no idea what had just happened. Even more concerning, they didn't know who this man was. An oppressive presence. The Zombie King's gaze locked onto the inspector. His eyes were piercing. His presence exuded overwhelming pressure. For some reason, she felt intense fear. She didn't recognize this man. That disappointed him. He expressed his frustration that she had forgotten about him. After all, he was the zombie she had been searching for. That revelation horrified her. This wasn't the image she had of him at all. In fact, she could have sworn he didn't look like this before. He explained that he had simply removed his mask. That was the only difference. As he stepped closer, she instinctively backed away. A generous gift. Since she had traveled such a long way, he had prepared a special gift. The best spicy eggs she would ever taste. Dozens of his citizens were already prepared to serve the meal. The protagonist reassured her not to worry. They'd only people. Then, without warning, he grabbed her by the clothes and lifted her off the ground. The city school district wasn't that interesting, so he decided to take her somewhere else. A terrifying leap with a devastating jump, he soared through the air, carrying the inspector with him. Her entire body was paralyzed with fear. Her assistants could only watch helplessly. They had no idea how to keep up. Meanwhile, his subordinates saw what was happening. They knew they needed to move immediately. The grand tour begins. They descended toward the ground at dangerous speed. The protagonist landed on the rooftop of a building, completely shattering the floor upon impact. Still holding the inspector, he told her to take a look. "This is my city," he declared, "and we're already starting to expand it." There were all kinds of professionals, even white-collar workers. There were cleaning crews, business operators, and people working hard to generate revenue. He was about to explain the city's laws and regulations, but the inspector was still paralyzed with fear. Since she wasn't moving, he continued dragging her through the streets. Law and order, Zombie Edition. He pointed out how everyone obeyed traffic laws. There were no infractions. Then, a truck driver suddenly panicked. Only his leg was visible, as if the rest of his body had been removed. The Zombie King calmly explained how lawbreakers were dealt with. They get launched into the sky. To demonstrate, he sent the truck flying. Even though it didn't have wings, it soared into the air like a rocket. The inspection team witnesses the madness. The inspection team was about to take a taxi when they noticed what had just happened. Now they could clearly see a truck embedded in one of the city's buildings. Blackie had acted quickly to save the driver's life. The inspector assumed that the driver had been executed, but the Zombie King confidently denied it. "That's impossible," he declared. "My subordinates possess unparalleled power." A sudden interruption. just as the inspector's assistants arrived to help her. The protagonist casually threw her in their direction. Even though the driver had been rescued, the bus remained stuck in the building. Once again, the protagonist reminded them that if they thought they had lived long enough, they just had to get in his way. After that brief explanation, all they could do was leave in fear. With nothing to say, silence filled the entire intersection. One of the assistants urged the chief inspector to leave quickly, as his legs were already getting weak. They didn't know if a person could do all that. There was definitely something wrong with that president. Compared to the strongest they knew, that man definitely didn't seem human. Seeing that they still hadn't left, the protagonist continued to watch them attentively. One thing was now certain. The person who had called in weak needed to be fired immediately. As they were about to leave, the chief inspector unexpectedly requested to stay a little longer. She admitted that he was doing an excellent job managing the city, but a president had to do more than that. He needed to have at least decent combat power. The protagonist's subordinates fell into complete despair. That sentence sounded like a major provocation. The woman stated that she hadn't yet seen the full extent of his power and wasn't sure if he was truly capable of protecting the entire city. Fearing what might happen next, the protagonist's subordinates immediately restrained her, completely terrified. Now they were genuinely worried that he might have overheard those words. The zombie halted his departure and remained silent for a long moment. He became very interested in the woman's statement. Apparently, she truly wanted to see everything he was capable of. His subordinates could only hope he would change his mind and not take it seriously. Agreeing to her request, everyone was escorted to a beach. The zombie with a sack on his head had a terrible feeling about what was about to happen. They all stood there, watching what the protagonist would do. The inspector had no idea why they had been brought to that location. It was easy to notice that the shadow of the protagonist's figure was overwhelmingly intimidating. Knowing his boss well, the zombie with a sack on his head felt the need to give the inspector a final word of advice. Everything, absolutely everything that happens from here on out is your fault. We have nothing to do with this anymore. Terrified by the warning, she exchanged glances briefly with the zombie. By then, he had already started to unleash his power. One of the men grew nervous as the rocks in the area began to float. The protagonist was emanating even greater power. His body was gradually transforming once again. Once more, he took on the form of a generic protagonist. Even though they had spent the entire day with zombies, it was the sight of a human face that truly terrified them. They couldn't understand what had happened to the protagonist. Until now, the ocean waves had been moving naturally. But after he began emanating all this power, the water had stopped as if it were a solid object. The entire atmosphere had become completely unnatural. The people around him could feel that even the air had changed in density. They had no idea what he was doing. Suddenly, he launched himself into the air, sending them flying backward. His strength was immeasurable, creating a small epicenter of shockwaves. Had it not been for the kindness of the zombies present, the inspector's assistants would still be airborne. She herself was unable to hold on to the ground. Looking ahead, she realized that the president had disappeared. They still had no idea what was happening or where he could have gone. Gently, a zombie handed her a telescope so she could see what was going on. Equipped with incredible lenses, the small telescope had a magnification capacity that should be impossible for its size. Now she was staring directly at the rings of Saturn. There was no doubt that this celestial body was unimaginably far from Earth. On the planet's surface, President Zombie walked calmly. Realizing the impossible, the inspector began to panic. Against all odds, that man had practically teleported to Saturn. Such was his speed. A distance thousands of times greater than Earth's circumference, a feat still impossible even with the most advanced technology. For them, this was the absolute limit. Even if he were human, what he had done was beyond human capabilities. Determined to demonstrate a little more of his power, the protagonist extended his hand. Slowly, he began to close his hand as if preparing his fists to unleash a strike, assuming an offensive and well-prepared stance. Once ready, he began to move his entire arm, unleashing an unbelievably powerful blow. Even from Earth, they could feel that it had surpassed the threshold of danger. Panicked, the lone shark ordered everyone to take cover immediately. The wind generated by that simple movement proved to be monumental, creating a small cataclysm in the middle of the ocean. Giant waves, worthy of an apocalyptic setting, began advancing toward the continent. On the beach where everyone stood, the humans could do nothing but panic and soil themselves. Back at headquarters, a violent earthquake began to shake the building. A loud alarm blared throughout the city. The level 12 tsunami had been detected. Violet, after hearing that, was completely in disbelief. It was truly terrifying. That massive water movement was more than enough to wipe out the entire human race. Dawn could do nothing but scream in terror. The truth was that even if they wanted to do something, they would never be capable. The city's defense system was activated at its initial level. Massive walls began to rise in an attempt to contain the advancing water. Meanwhile, in the middle of the ocean, there was something resembling a clearing. The water had been forced away from the area. At the epicenter of the impact stood the protagonist, wanting to know if that demonstration of power was sufficient proof of his strength. From outside Earth's atmosphere, it was possible to see the full magnitude of it. After witnessing that, the inspector was speechless, while the protagonist watched them like ants. Transforming once again, he began heading back to his city with his subordinates. Meanwhile, the inspection team had come to a logical conclusion. Even monsters were more human than that person. Their taxi drove away toward the place they never should have left. Despite the excessive display of power, it was certain that the city would not be taken from them. While all of that was happening, on the other side of the planet, inside the prison, interesting developments were unfolding. The soldiers remained vigilant. Analyzing the body of the Zombie King, they still couldn't comprehend how the zombie had managed to defeat him. It was impressive that the mad professor had created a life form like that. Basically, he had tried to create a god. It was a shame that the creature wasn't alive. After what had happened, it hadn't shown any vital signs. Behind them, manipulating a test tube, an undercover spy was carrying out his task. Following the precise instructions given by the professor, he was carefully mixing the ingredients in the correct proportions so that the zombie could be revived once again. He had to wait for a window of opportunity to inject the solution into the dormant body. As soon as the patrol guard announced he would step out for his round, the spy began his mission, managing to strike the creature's neck with the injection. It didn't take long before he was immediately seized by the floor's head officer. Desperate, the officer demanded to know if the spy had any idea what he had just done. The creature's eyes glowed with evil once more. Suddenly, explosions began to erupt throughout the prison. The president, who had previously underestimated the zombie, was now completely terrified. Throughout the prison, alarms blared loudly. Smoke billowed across the corridors from the rubble and destruction. The Zombie King was awake once again as if he had returned from a long nightmare. He received orders from the professor to get them out of there. The professor promised to make him even stronger than that other monster. In the air, an aircraft was approaching the prison. Inside, someone was furiously kicking the hatch, keeping them locked in. With one final kick, the door was sent flying outside, putting all passengers in danger. The plane had been hijacked, and the hijackers ordered everyone to remain still. As long as they cooperated, no one would get hurt. Given the situation, the crew members decided to comply. The Blood Queen was now dressed properly. Air access was the only way in. Her subordinate reminded her about the bomb attached to the professor's body. She knew that, but there were no other options. She believed it was nothing more than a human trick. If she couldn't handle it herself, she wouldn't be worthy of being called a queen. As soon as they flew over the target location, they jumped from the aircraft toward the prison. The queen's orders were clear. They must be even more brutal than the humans. Inside the prison, several presidents were alerted to the invasion. It all seemed like a grand conspiracy to trigger a mass breakout. Everyone needed to be on high alert. The vampires had already entered the facility, encountering heavy resistance from the soldiers. One of the humans told everyone to stay calm since there were still 30 presidents inside the facility. In the lower levels, they realized that prison break might be underway. The Blood Queen didn't seem impressed by anything happening around her. She was in the upper levels, and between her and the professor, all of the presidents were stationed to secure the facility. Down in the lowest level, where the true prisoner was held, one of the presidents had already received his fair share of beatings. The Zombie King had done it with ease. He hated the professor, and his true intention was to leave him there to rot. Giving a subtle smirk, the professor seemed like he had expected this reaction. His bespectacled lackey began to panic. The professor said that this was his creation. It wasn't just some zombie capable of defeating him. It was better not to try anything foolish in his presence. Provoked by those words, the creature started to become hostile. But before it could act, the professor calmly reassured it. As long as he was helped to achieve his dreams, he had no interest in staying alive. The Zombie King acknowledged that humans were terrifying and admitted that he was interested in becoming even stronger. With that, the professor assured him that he never went back on his words. Outside the prison walls, they could hear the tremors and explosions. The presidents were struggling to hold back the invaders. They had no idea who these people were, nor did they care. The Blood Queen had no intention of explaining herself to mere extras. With unshakable confidence, she advanced toward them. She gave them two choices. Either they hand over the professor, or they find out just how strong she really was. Determined to fulfill their duty, the first president decided to attack. Despite the hostility, the queen still didn't move. These presidents were resolute. They wouldn't let her do as she pleased inside the prison. But the fight was over faster than expected. Pieces of cyborgs were scattered across the floor. It had all happened so fast that no one even saw what occurred. The soldiers, being just normal humans, were terrified. Still, they opened fire. The queen knew that their human weaponry posed zero threat to her. The assault rifles began to sing their song of violence. But the bullets hit her skin and fell to the ground. They couldn't even tear her clothes. She was completely unfazed. Not even a single blink was necessary. One of the vampires stretched out her hand, mocking human technology. More explosions erupted inside the prison. Meanwhile, on the lower levels, the professor's rescue mission continued. The mad scientist was shocked that the bomb hadn't been triggered. That's when the mad professor revealed that they had a 2-second window after the power ran out. Now they could continue their escape. The scientist was worried about making that creature even stronger, but the professor had 2 more bodies even more powerful than that. Finally, they managed to free the professor from his prison chamber. The initial sight left the Zombie King intrigued. The humans there already seemed defeated, and judging by their condition, the enemy was really strong. Something else was happening here. A mysterious figure stood among the bodies. The Blood Queen finally revealed herself. She had come to meet the professor. She told him that anyone unable to even touch the zombie in his second form was unworthy as an experiment. The scientist panicked, wondering how she knew about that. Meanwhile, the Zombie King wondered who this woman was. Since they shared a common enemy, she suggested using her body for their cause. Demonstrating all of her scientific and technical expertise, she waited for the professor's response. Feeling challenged, the Zombie King wanted to know if this barely dressed woman thought she was stronger than him. She confirmed it and even added that it wasn't just by a small margin. If she wanted, she could prove it right there. Immediately, the two clashed. The queen came out on top. Her blow landed, a completely unexpected result for those who didn't know her. She demonstrated overwhelming power. If the zombie had wings, he would have flown away, because now he looked like a projectile. smashing through everything in his path. Having already been beaten by the protagonist, he could tell from experience that her power was on par with his. But he refused to let the fight end that way. Looking at the nuclear reactor of the prison, he suddenly had a brilliant idea. An idea worthy of a true genius. If he couldn't win, then everyone would turn to dust with him. Striking the reactor with all his might, the mad scientist took the opportunity to say that this guy was never trustworthy. A chain reaction started, and it was only a matter of time before everything blew up. With a simple gesture of her hand, the queen looked at the reactor. Then she lowered her hand, fingers outstretched. She had given a command to reality itself, reversing the explosion. A demonstration of power that none of them had expected. As if that weren't enough, it was as if she had controlled gravity itself, crushing the immortal creature under the weight of that massive weapon. His ashen body now resembled a piece of gum stuck to the pavement. The humans struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. That sight was undeniably terrifying. The queen mocked the creature, a being so weak yet arrogant enough to carry the title of king. It was time to teach him a small lesson. With the creature in her hands, she wanted to know how the protagonist had defeated him. Even though he heard the question, the defeated creature was still processing his brutal loss. The queen's gaze showed no patience. That's when he realized how distant he was from true power. He had seen this before. These two creatures were monsters from a civilization that no longer existed. A deep terror began to consume his mind, until he became completely motionless before her. The queen had shown him where he truly belonged. Dropping his limp body onto the ground, the once revived zombie king stopped breathing once again. With that, she also demonstrated her power to everyone there. She had subjugated a mighty existence as if it were nothing. The zombie king before her was nothing but an insect. The presidents who had been defeated by that creature were now certain that this woman was in a league of her own. Even the mad scientist struggled to believe what he had just witnessed. Finally, she turned her attention to the professor. She wanted to know if he was good enough to be her experiment. She was waiting for a positive response, but the professor was too stunned to answer immediately. After what he had just seen, she was more than enough. At the top of City A's town hall, the misbehaving zombie was still being punished. Violet had arrived to speak with the protagonist. She had an urgent matter. She was warned that this wasn't a good time, but since it was an emergency, she couldn't delay. His subordinate tried to warn her that it was dangerous. Paying attention to those words, Violet said she had no idea what he was talking about. She entered the president's office saying she had terrible news. The protagonist greeted her casually, revealing that he was in his second form. Now she understood the danger she was in, but she found it strange that the protagonist was speaking so calmly despite being in that state. He said he liked to change things up sometimes and wanted to know what had brought her there. Without hesitation, she reported that the professor had escaped from prison. He already knew that, because humans would never be able to contain that red-headed woman. It had happened about 10 minutes ago, and Violet couldn't understand how he already knew. The queen had used her bloodline power, and he had felt the energy. The term bloodline made Violet stop and think. She needed to take that information back to her superiors. Since she was already there, the protagonist asked her not to rush off. It had been a while since he had interacted peacefully with a human. Out of all possible things, that was not the request she expected. Shaking off his hand, she said she already knew what had happened to the inspector, stating that she didn't have time to play tour guide with him. They were in the middle of a crisis and she was needed elsewhere. That's when the protagonist asked if she wanted to know how he used his bloodline power. That question piqued her interest. She never imagined he possessed such an ability. Fixing his gaze on her threateningly, the protagonist simply smiled. Violet was left speechless. Faced with the opportunity to learn, she agreed to go on a date with him. Inside the hospital, chaos had taken over. They were trying to revive the defeated presidents. Despite their severe injuries, they were still breathing. The doctor noticed that the chief wanted to say something. Approaching him, he leaned in to listen. It was crucial to speak with the department head. Meanwhile, the villains were finally gathered in a safe location. It was deeply disappointing that the queen was now wearing more casual clothes. It was the first time the professor had analyzed such an astounding body. The vampire warned that the experiment better work as they were not patient. But the scientist insisted that the professor's research was the cornerstone of human progress. There had been a previous success achieved by the protagonist himself. Even if she was a vampire, the experiment would work. All they needed were the protagonist's genes. Knowing this, the vampires hoped they wouldn't be the ones tasked with collecting that genetic material. The professor assured them he wasn't stupid enough to send them to their doom. Even so, they were still uneasy about possibly being sent on a dangerous mission. They wanted to know how he planned to obtain the material and whether he expected it to be delivered as a gift. The queen also seemed interested in the matter. With a mocking grin, the scientist prepared to reveal something. They already had a sample of the genetic material. The vampires were stunned. They had no idea how he had obtained it. A human had collected the genes while undergoing several experiments to see if she had turned into a zombie. One of the professor's spies had managed to extract a sample. The vampires were impressed by human cunning. Having spies planted among enemies was an extremely useful strategy. It was time to begin. In City H, Violet had gone out to dinner with a protagonist. His power lived up to his name, but she was afraid that she might not return to her usual self, or worse, that there might be side effects. Faced with her doubts, he simply smiled. Violet expected him to continue explaining, But the protagonist had returned to his base form, which annoyed her. He wasn't supposed to change forms before finishing his explanation. That was irresponsible. Filled with frustration, she tried to force him to switch back to the second form. But the protagonist had no intention of doing so. Reminding her that he never forced her to go out with him, she came because she wanted to. Asking the waiter for some pepper, she learned that all of it had been confiscated from the city. After that meeting, 2 long months passed. It was the second time the woman had visited the man in the hospital. His final order had been for the message to be transmitted. After that, he lost consciousness. She did as instructed, using satellites to classify the message as a code red emergency. It was truly remarkable that a single woman had done all of that in the prison. The vampire had reversed a nuclear explosion. Moreover, she didn't seem to belong to this era. The woman already knew that, and all of this information had been passed on to the department head. In the underground of an abandoned city, several electronic devices were still active. It looked like a secret underground city with extremely advanced knowledge. One of the men seemed to have received a message. Approaching the department head, he reported that there was an ongoing emergency. Dressed in an incredibly cool suit of armor, with a hairstyle that would only make battles harder, the department head finally appeared. Among the ancient ruins, they had found human remains. Among them, a mummy. This was the only genetic material they had managed to find in this abandoned city. A soldier reported the details of the emergency. Professor Jamie, who had been imprisoned, had escaped. This news was so shocking that even the other soldiers looked uneasy. Before them lay a body from an ancient era of humanity. Upon closer analysis, they noticed 134 fractures. Certainly, they had been caused by a monster. This brief description sent shivers through the soldiers. More terrifying still, the body had been burned until it was completely dried out, preserving it for thousands of years. Now, it was nothing more than an empty husk. Examining the area, it was clear that a great battle had once taken place there. The creature that had destroyed this highly advanced civilization was truly formidable. There was nothing left to search for. The department head wanted to know more about the emergency. He learned that several presidents had been injured in the incident. The headquarters was in a state of emergency since its combat power had been weakened. Realizing this, the department head decided it was time to return. Before they left, one of the soldiers noticed something. There were inscriptions carved into the ground of the ancient city. This activated a long-dormant system. Metallic spheres began to float, and a hologram appeared before them. It was astonishing that this technology had survived for so long. The figure within the hologram remarked that it was the first time they had seen a human with such a powerful body. The soldiers urged the department head to be cautious, but to him it was just a projection. Shrouded in mystery, the holographic figure studied the men. It claimed it could make the department head even stronger as long as he swore to protect humanity. To him, that was only natural. His desire within those ruins was to better understand history and to learn how an entire civilization had been annihilated. Behind the mysterious figure, a film began to play. The humans waited patiently to see what would be revealed to them. Unexpectedly, the figure that appeared behind them was none other than the protagonist. It was so bizarre that it almost felt like a bad joke. 1,000 years ago, Earth wasn't limited to just 2 large continents. There were 8 oceans, 7 continents, and multiple nations. Humanity had united to the point where they could produce incredible items. They had reached a level of knowledge that allowed them to construct space stations. Their technology had advanced beyond imagination, allowing them to create incredible weapons. They had even fought against aliens, and yet the technology of those extraterrestrials was no match for what humanity had developed. Even monsters hidden in the depths of Earth feared mankind. But there was one being they had never been able to defeat, the zombie. After hearing this brief history, they wondered why they had failed to stop him. But he was the answer to everything. He was the reason for all of it. It wasn't hard to believe, but it also wasn't the answer they had expected. One soldier suspected they were being deceived. The person in the photo didn't even look strong. To the department head, the ancient civilization wouldn't waste its time telling lies. The academies exist to resist zombies. Yet despite humanity's efforts, they had never managed to wipe them out. Perhaps this person was the reason their goal had never been achieved. The department head wanted to know what their next move should be. Their time was running out. They had focused on technology, but now, after seeing such a powerful body, there was hope. The union of a strong physical body with the technology of the past. They could defeat that creature. Then, a gauntlet emerged. It was the technology of the ancient civilization. The holographic projection warned them not to forget. No matter what race appeared on Earth, humanity's greatest enemy would always be the zombies. The department head ordered a soldier to take the artifact, but he was hesitant. Holding the object, he promised that humanity would not disappoint them. All that remained in that place was the dried-up corpse. There was nothing else of value to collect. A soldier asked if they were going to hunt down the person in the photo, but their immediate priority was dealing with the professor's escape. The world was too big. Finding a single zombie would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. On the phone, Violet received an important call. Finally, the department head had returned and was calling for a meeting with all the presidents. The zombie was surprised that he was also required to attend. He had no idea who the department head even was. In the professor's lab, his experiments seemed to be progressing successfully. He smiled enthusiastically, believing he had finally reached his goal. The Queen's body was being enhanced. Bit by bit, the protagonist's genes were being assimilated into her. Meanwhile, the Queen's vampire underlings were growing tired of waiting. The entire wealth of their tribe amounted to a single coin. Even if they had 10 jobs, they wouldn't be able to feed their people. Even that coin had been obtained through begging. Their lives had become so miserable that they wished it would just end. One companion reminded them that they were strong. They should find another way to make a living. The idea seemed like a joke. They couldn't think of anything profitable. So his companion suggested something simple. Let's rob a bank. On their way, they passed a bank. Inside, the people seemed incredibly slow. A simple withdrawal took almost an hour. They had never seen people move so sluggishly. With their skills, they could rob the place in 10 seconds. They would never be caught. All they had to do was take the money and leave. That was all it took to convince the vampire to commit a small crime. Meanwhile, at headquarters, everyone was gathering. A soldier informed the department head that all the presidents were present. The meeting could finally begin. The department head put on his extremely cool helmet. Now he was ready. This was the zombies' first time having to obey a superior as a president. Meanwhile, the Blood Queen continued being enhanced by the protagonist's genes. In a specific city filled with slow-moving people, someone was preparing to rob a bank. It was the Queen's underlings. They were analyzing the people's movements. Everything truly seemed to move at a different pace. Now they were ready to execute their plan. The entire operation had been meticulously planned. There would be no room for mistakes. The bank had been studied. There weren't many people inside, and they were professionals at robbing banks. From the top floor of a building, the lone shark waited for updates about the city. The reports from last month were finally available for review. At last, the robbers had put their elaborate plan into action. They entered the bank heavily armed without realizing it was the Bank of City Et, the Bank of the Zombies. According to the soldiers' calculations, the economic assets of the city exceeded 430 billion. The lone shark ordered a recalculation. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes since they were subordinates of the strongest being. The soldiers, enthusiastic and determined, agreed without hesitation. Meanwhile, on the first floor, the vampires announced the robbery. It didn't take long for them to gain access to the money. The amount was truly staggering. The lone shark noticed suspicious activity in the city. The vampires were already escaping, celebrating that they would never have to live in poverty again. Then an important alert arrived. Blackie was informed that they had just been robbed. That couldn't be real. It was unacceptable that something like this had happened in this city. Faced with so much money, the vampire leader couldn't hide his happiness. For a brief moment, he felt a threatening presence calling his name. It was familiar. He had felt this before in his life. Then he realized who was furious with him. He couldn't believe his underling hadn't checked who owned that bank. Unfortunately, his subordinate could never have known, because he couldn't read. They had just learned the hard way that the bank they robbed was the Bank of the Zombies. They were definitely in for a long and severe beating. Their escape was quickly intercepted. The vampire leader was already panicking. He could feel it, even from a distance. The threatening aura of the zombies. Now the financial administrator of the city was pursuing the thieves. The vampire's desperation kept increasing dramatically. He ordered the driver to accelerate because the lone shark was the most mysterious of the zombies' subordinates. He had been with him for years. Blackie didn't care what the vampires were doing, but he had one piece of advice if they wanted to stay alive. He moved forward, determined to deliver his message. His advice was simple. Whoever didn't want to perish at the hands of the lone shark should return the money immediately. With a single leap, he generated a shockwave that shook the entire building. Cars were sent flying and people inside the building had no idea what was happening. Outside, chaos became even more apparent. The vampires couldn't believe what was happening. That display of power was excessively overwhelming. The money they had stolen wouldn't even be enough to repair their car. They were completely doomed. They knew it. The lone shark was out of control. Blackie remained firm in his demands. The vampire leader ordered them to split up and warn the queen about what they had done. He decided to stay behind, saying he would hold off the pursuer. He was curious to see if he could match his strength, but Blackie reminded him none of them were authorized to flee, and they were definitely not on equal footing in this fight. The lone shark began to use his fists to collect the debt. Seeing the brutal scene, the other vampires started to panic. Their leader was already completely out of combat. At the headquarters city, the presidents remained gathered. They were waiting for the department head to arrive. When he finally appeared, he was immediately saluted by everyone. He was aware of the professor's escape, but had an even more important matter to discuss with them. He revealed the artifact recovered from the ancient ruins. They were intrigued by the golden gauntlet. It was a piece of technology from ancient times. All the presidents were stunned by the discovery. The department head said he had found it in the deepest part of the canyon. One of the supporting officers believed this could change the battle against the professor, until the department head stated that it would be used against an even greater evil. According to the message left by the ancient civilization, there was a far greater threat on Earth, the one responsible for the destruction of that civilization. Knowing that such a monster existed terrified the presidents. Violet even asked if it was a joke, because the existence of such a being was overwhelming. The department head confirmed that the ancient civilization had emphasized the danger of this existence. They must be cautious about it. For Violet, it was impossible that such a powerful being could still exist. The department head admitted that he didn't know where this creature was located, but he reiterated that they must remain vigilant. The protagonist, intrigued by the gauntlet, asked how it should be used. The department head explained that they only needed to wear it and press the activation button. He emphasized that they must find this creature and eliminate it as soon as possible. The realization struck suddenly. there was someone next to him who caught his attention. He turned to look at the protagonist, confirming that the same foolish expression belonged to the threatening entity. It was impossible that he had been there the entire time. The department head acted swiftly to grab the gauntlet, leaving everyone stunned. Meanwhile, the vampire's body was on a collision course with the headquarters building. Strangely, the plot made sure he crashed directly into the meeting room. The dust settled, and the department head now held the gauntlet. Violet couldn't quite understand what was happening. The room was partially destroyed from the impact, and the vampire was lying in a corner, visibly defeated. Blackie arrived just after the vampire. He was determined to punish him for what he had done in his city. The vampire whimpered, wishing to be saved by his queen. Nobody knew who these people were, and they had never seen that vampire before. But Violet quickly realized that he was one of the protagonist's subordinates. The zombie, also intrigued, asked what the lone shark was doing there. One of the soldiers detected something with his systems. Blackie continued observing from outside. He was now completely surrounded by the most powerful presidents. One of the side characters was determined to show this zombie that he did not belong here. Furious, Blackie declared that this wasn't their concern, and began demonstrating, gently, the gap between their power levels. The presidents were being punched as if they were children. Even that small group was no match for a single subordinate of the protagonist. They were easily and efficiently subdued. The side character had now fully accepted his role in the story. He always belonged to the group that gets beaten up. The women noticed that Blackie was much stronger than the chainsaw zombie. The side character was strategically placed next to the vampire, since both were always getting beaten up. Blackie had lost patience. It was time to eliminate some people. The dust seemed dangerous. Violet warned the girl not to touch it, but the protagonist was already prepared to correct his subordinate. Gently, he interrupted Blackie's aggressive actions. Blackie was already on his way to being completely neutralized. He was caught off guard by the presence of his boss. Another shockwave erupted, sending the others flying. A soldier informed the department head about the new president's strength. The presidents standing before him were like ants. The ancient civilization was right. He was truly powerful. After stopping his subordinate, the protagonist took him to the top of a building. Blackie wanted to know what was going on. The zombie reminded him that he couldn't kill people. Meanwhile, the department head activated the gauntlet. The protagonist was explaining to his subordinate that this was the headquarters of the people who gave them the city. His brief speech was interrupted. A solar eclipse began forming in the sky. This was unexpected. None of the humans could explain its origin. The sky darkened completely. Even the citizens were growing anxious. Finally, the Blood Queen made her first appearance since her enhancement. People began to notice that there was someone in the midst of the darkness. The department head was trying to understand what was happening. The presidents who had guarded the prison knew exactly who she was. With a malicious smile, the queen declared that she was now completely invincible. The other vampires arrived to rescue their comrade, who was still motionless on the ground after his brutal beating. Seeing his fragile state, the queen ordered her subordinates to retrieve him. But they were easily stopped by the department head's power. They couldn't do anything against that human, and the queen quickly noticed. But she didn't seem to care. Knowing the situation would escalate, the department head ordered the city's evacuation. The queen smirked and told the human to mind his own business. This wasn't his concern. With the gauntlet in hand, the department head managed to strike her. She felt pain and immediately became enraged. She returned the attack with equal intensity. The other women realized that the queen was on another level of strength. Blackie informed the protagonist that the humans had started fighting. However, the zombies said that this wasn't their problem. The battle continued, and the eclipse was already disappearing. The gauntlet on the department head's arm began to change its composition. Confident, he declared he would eliminate the queen before dealing with the zombie. "That's quite bold of you," the woman said as the protagonist's friends started wondering which zombie he was referring to. Focusing all the power of the gauntlet, the department head aimed to settle everything with a single strike. But the queen was unfazed. She also wanted to finish things quickly. Like two Dragon Ball Z characters, they were on a collision course. The queen prepared a devastating blow, while the department head did the same. They were mere moments away from clashing above the city. The resulting shockwave was absolutely overwhelming. As expected, the gauntlet was overpowered by the queen's fist. The department head was sent flying across the city, crashing catastrophically into a building. With his arm shattered and the gauntlet destroyed, he struggled to recover. The queen wasn't even slightly impressed by such a mediocre display of power. And the department head was beginning to believe that the so-called ancient technology was a scam. "If this is what I was relying on, I shouldn't have even tried," he muttered. The queen acknowledged that he was the strongest human she had ever faced. 1,000 years ago, their battle might have had a different outcome, but that wasn't the case in the present. Now she would send him into an eternal slumber. Before she could land the finishing blow, she felt an ominous threat approaching. A clean and powerful slash was executed. She narrowly avoided being hit. Violet declared that the queen was fighting the wrong person. The queen wanted to know who this dangerous individual was. With her sword resting on her back, Violet announced herself as the queen's opponent. Her expression had changed completely. She was now using the genes she had received from the protagonist. Those who witnessed her transformation were left speechless. Meanwhile, the vampire girl was still trying to rescue her fallen friend. But Dawn wasn't going to let that happen so easily. Seeing that the woman had also transformed, the vampire trembled in fear, realizing how bizarre these people were. The queen quickly noticed the presence of another enhanced woman. The two exchanged brief glares while the vampire declared that her opponent wouldn't get away with this. The three powerful women were on the brink of battle. Violet's aura had changed completely. With her sword drawn, she prepared to attack the queen. The department head remained gravely wounded. No one could say for sure what had happened to Violet, but she was very different now. The vampire refused to let Dawn have her way with her. Breaking free from her grip, she quickly created distance between them. This only made Dawn even more interested in her prey. Irritated, the vampire declared that she wasn't just any ordinary opponent. If you're not weak, then prove it, Dawn challenged. Seeing the vampire's attack approach, she wasn't impressed by its speed. She intercepted it with ease. This was a fight with an already determined outcome. Dawn started overpowering the vampire effortlessly. The observing presidents had no idea she was this strong. Performing bizarre acrobatics, the vampire attempted to evade the attacks. But there was a hidden trick in her movements. Using a small amount of her own blood, she created clones of herself, but none of them were a match for Dawn. The clones quickly vanished, and the vampire now doubted whether Dawn was even human. The Blood Queen was preparing to fight. Violet also made a move with her sword, but her power was immense. She sliced cleanly through the buildings behind her. Now the main headquarters was on the verge of collapse to the absolute horror of the presidents. The sheer power was absurd, reminding them of something familiar. The queen recognized what had happened. This woman had also been strengthened. But the queen's desire remained unchanged. She wanted revenge on her oldest enemy. She opened her eyes, revealing that her pupils had transformed. She had been waiting for this moment for a long time and was willing to do anything to achieve her goal. Despite the display of power, Violet was unfazed. She admitted she wasn't a match for the queen, but if that was all she had, she should give up on avenging herself against the zombie. And now let me show you something really entertaining. Violet smirked, piquing the queen's curiosity. Placing her hand over her face, her power began to shift. She was about to reveal her second transformation. The skin on her face started changing, altering its color. Violet's body twisted unnaturally, and the presidents continued their never-ending journey of being increasingly impressed by this battle. Violet had become much stronger. Even the queen was now uncertain of what to expect from her. Condensed energy began taking shape, glowing with a deep violet hue. The presidents had to shield themselves from the force emanating from her, and the queen was genuinely taken aback as a mask formed on Violet's face. Her expressionless visage bore cold, deep eyes. The presidents were utterly terrified, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The queen, too, was deeply impressed. Even the protagonist hadn't expected such rapid progress. Dawn also became intrigued by this newfound ability to change forms. After observing everything unfold, the queen became lost in thought. Violet declared that words were a waste of time now. This time, the queen took the offensive, but Violet was just as skilled in wielding her sword. Both were fully prepared to continue their battle. The queen declared that only the weak rely on words. Violet coated her blade in a crimson liquid. The enhancement immediately fortified her sword, increasing its resistance and power. She struck the queen with an overwhelming blow. The sheer level of power was so shocking that it began to terrify the onlookers. Violet had managed to slice her opponent down to a cellular level, leaving behind only minuscule fragments of what was once a person. As fear gripped the humans, desperation consumed the vampires at the thought that their queen had been defeated. Violet calmly sheathed her sword, assuming the battle was over. The sensors confirmed that every cell in the queen's body had somehow been severed. This had to be a joke. Such a feat should be impossible. The blue-haired woman didn't doubt what had happened. The department head remained frozen, speechless. Violet knew the queen was still alive, plotting an unexpected counterattack. Slowly, her scattered cells began merging in the air, reforming her body. Violet stood waiting, allowing the queen to fully restore herself. Her reconstruction was happening at a molecular level. She emerged completely regenerated, but with one small difference. Her clothes had not been restored at all. The watching presidents could no longer tell if these beings were even human. Meanwhile, the protagonist noticed that Red was about to start fighting seriously. Interested in the battle, he suggested they move somewhere with a better view. Violet was already aware of her opponent's immortality, but the department head, who had been unaware, was now visibly shaken. He began to feel something shifting in the gauntlet. The protagonist warned everyone to leave the building as things were about to become much more dangerous. The queen was now fully clothed once again, and Violet remained ready to fight. The vampire raised her hand toward the sky, and a massive cataclysm began to form. Furious, she declared that the battle was far from over. Violet was pleased to hear this. She also wanted to keep fighting. The protagonist had found a safe spot to observe the battle. The blue-haired woman and another president arrived at his position. Meanwhile, Violet and the queen were spreading destruction throughout the city. Simple movements of the queen's blade had catastrophic results. With a series of strikes, she completely sliced through an entire building. It crumbled into the air as if it had been made of paper. Violet had avoided all of the attacks, and now she was closing in on her opponent. Their blades clashed with intense force. But this time, the human was caught off guard by a surprise attack. However, she wasn't about to allow herself to be defeated. She retaliated with a devastating strike against the queen. The watching presidents could feel their souls nearly leaving their bodies. Only one person was truly enjoying this battle: the protagonist, who continued to watch gleefully. Violet's slash extended for thousands of kilometers. The queen realized the sheer magnitude of that strike. She was far from pleased with how things were unfolding, but her determination never wavered for even a moment. The protagonist remained thoroughly entertained by this overwhelming display of power. The blue-haired woman couldn't comprehend how the queen was still alive. The department head struggled as the gauntlet refused to detach from his arm. Meanwhile, Violet remained fixated on her objective, defeating the threat before her. The queen had no intention of making her job easy. Even knowing that Violet had a second transformation, she did not believe the human could match her. This time, taking the offensive, she was determined to end everything. She'd executed a devastating palm strike capable of leveling an entire city. Her attack was overwhelming, and the bystanders knew that if they were caught in it, they'd be done for. Violet failed to defend herself against the strike. Her body absorbed the impact almost entirely. The queen waited for a reaction from her opponent. This left the humans deeply worried. Violet remained motionless after the attack. The department head continued to struggle with the gauntlet, which was now harming his arm. A voice announced that it would take control of his body. He had no idea who the voice belonged to, even as he felt himself losing control. Then he realized it was the same voice from the hologram he had encountered. Violet managed to briefly recover, agreeing with what the queen had said. The two women observed each other with cold gazes. Pulling the sword from her body, Violet acknowledged that she couldn't harm the queen. But that wasn't the only thing she had to say. The queen also couldn't harm her at all. The blue-haired woman realized what had happened and demanded that the protagonist give her the same power. But he refused, knowing that the consequences were often far too violent. While they were distracted, something massive occurred. Neither Violet nor the queen had been aware of what had just happened. Even the bystanders couldn't determine what had caused the strange sound. Outside the Earth's atmosphere, colossal limbs began to appear. Something had been revived. The sheer size of the being rivaled the planet itself. Its shadow stretched across entire regions of the globe. Panic immediately gripped the citizens, who had no idea what they were witnessing. Back in the city, destruction continued to spread. Only the protagonist seemed capable of surviving it. He quickly noticed that people were in danger. Moving at immense speed, he reached them. One by one, he hurled the humans far away from the danger zone. The zombies understood that the entire city had now become extremely hazardous, and that monstrous figure had locked its focus on the two battling women. It was a robot of unfathomable proportions. Both the queen and Violet had to pause their fight. Neither of them knew what had brought this colossal machine into existence. Inside the robot, even the department head was at a loss for what was happening. The man from the hologram apologized it had been necessary to deceive him. He had to sacrifice himself for the sake of humanity. Some of the presidents had managed to reach safety, thanks to the protagonist. The most cowardly among them wanted to know what was happening. The others had no words left. Outside Earth's atmosphere, the colossal robot ascended. Violet had no idea what was going on. Within the robot's massive fingers, the protagonist was being held. Passengers aboard nearby aircraft were utterly stunned by the surreal scene unfolding before them. Gradually, the protagonist's expression began to change. Faced with this new enemy, the women seemed to silently agree to a temporary truce. The robot assured them that this had nothing to do with them. It was controlled by a humanoid figure of regular size, yet strong enough to restrain the two women. Due to their proximity, Violet ended up being captured. The queen as well. The controller of the robot declared that they had been studying zombies for centuries. It was disappointing that the women had attacked using nothing more than stimulants. Throughout this dialogue, the protagonist remained in the robot's grasp. But now he had entered his first transformation. With much greater strength at his disposal, he began twisting his torso. The force of his rotation surged through the robot's fingers. The power traveled up his arm in an instant. The robot's controller had not anticipated such a rapid escalation. The protagonist was already advancing toward the core of the problem. At a terrifying speed, he closed the distance. But he was suddenly intercepted. The robot countered his approach. This ancient existence had waited an entire millennium. At last, the day had arrived. The women, who had proven themselves overwhelmingly strong, had been completely subdued. And the protagonist did not like being delayed one bit. The time for his rematch has come. The man desires to finally defeat the zombie and witness its true form. Granting his request, the protagonist transformed into a generic character. Even though the robot's hand is enormous, it is incapable of stopping him. The protagonist hurled away with little effort. Observing this while completely immobilized, the queen couldn't help but be surprised. For now, the battle taking place is between the zombie and the giant robot. The ancient existence felt it was being utterly underestimated. And indeed, none of it was impressive to the zombie. Still on Earth, the blue-haired woman couldn't hide her shock. Climbing up the robot's body, the protagonist made his way toward its controller. A small crack began to open, revealing a massive compartment. Inside the larger robot, several humanoid drones were ready for battle. Faced with all of this, the presidents felt technologically primitive. Even with superior numbers, the drones could do nothing against the protagonist. He continued destroying them as if they were made of clay. On the arm of the larger robot, they tried to delay him in every way possible. But there was nothing they could do against absolute power. In his most powerful form, the zombie was utterly overwhelming. He was even capable of damaging the largest of the robots. Recognizing his anniversary, the ancient existence realized that its enemy wasn't using his full power, summoning even more giant robots to Earth. The battle became increasingly absurd as time went on. The ancient consciousness revealed that it remembered its last night. It had been able to observe everything that had happened. That powerful form was not the zombie's final form. Imagining that he could become even stronger, human common sense could no longer contain their fear. The protagonist was struck by a blow from one of the robots. Those celestial bodies clashing were destroying Earth's cities. The force of that impact had planetary-scale consequences. The protagonist was thrown toward the moon, causing massive destruction. His body ricocheted several times across the lunar surface. Even so, none of it affected him or changed his expression. Trying to regain control of his body, the department chief disagreed with such destruction. But the ancient entity was determined to eliminate humanity's enemy at all costs. The robots continued their relentless pursuit of the zombie. The most astonishing thing was that even on Earth, the presidents seemed to know what was happening. It was possible to see that on the moon there was a massive robot resembling a human. The ancient man remained determined to eliminate humanity's enemy. The protagonist continued to dodge every attack. Once again, he managed to get close to one of the robot's faces, preparing to deliver another one of his powerful blows, striking the construct directly in a devastating manner. His unprecedented strength caused irreversible destruction. The ancient entity was running out of resources. The department chief said he had read the reports. Since becoming president, the protagonist's conduct had been impeccable and just. He continued trying to regain control of his body. The city under the protagonist's administration kept progressing with no evidence that he had harmed humans. In fact, he helped them quite frequently. This made the department chief consider the possibility of coexistence, but the ancient entity refused to accept such a thing, redirecting its violent drive to attack the protagonist. It claimed they had already attempted peaceful coexistence in past eras, but just looking at the protagonist was enough to understand the reality. There was no way to coexist peacefully with someone so powerful. Zombies were supposed to be an insignificant race, and they always have been, until the protagonist appeared out of nowhere. Since then, humanity's fate had depended on this person's mood. An entity like that could not continue to exist. He did not belong to humanity. And that was why he deserved to be destroyed immediately. Changing form, the robot was now preparing to unleash its most powerful attack, divine punishment. Several robots like it began appearing in the lunar atmosphere. Their swords pierced through the entire planet. Massive waves of electrical energy surged from the moon. Even so, none of it could stop the protagonist, who recognized the human had been striving for strength. But just because he was bigger or had greater numbers didn't mean he had attained it. This realization left the ancient entity terrified. All it took from the protagonist was a simple snap of his fingers. Immediately, the robots were destroyed until they turned to dust. Massive earthquakes were spreading across the lunar surface. The effects of this magnificent battle were already reaching Earth itself. Faced with the imminent danger, the presidents decided they had to help evacuate the citizens from the city. Finally, the protagonist had approached the main body. Landing an indefensible blow on its face, he directed his enemy toward Earth. It fell into the ocean like a meteor. Meanwhile, the protagonist decided to land on the continent. Using his hands, he began to separate the land beneath his feet. Truly, there wasn't much that could be done against all that power. Inside the city, the presidents were already focused on the complete evacuation. Citizens frantically searched for shelter. The blue-haired woman noticed a crack that kept growing. She had no idea what it could mean. The protagonist continued to split the continent with his hands. Soon, all humans were overwhelmed by sheer terror. Once again, something of planetary proportions was occurring. Sensors detected that the earthquake had already reached 20 points on the measurement scale. As simple as tearing a sheet of paper, he had split the continent in two. Not even a feat of this magnitude required effort from the protagonist. Now, in the middle of the city, a massive rift separated it into two halves. Completely over the top, distracted by the imminent danger, the blue-haired woman fell into the abyss. It was so deep that its bottom couldn't be seen. Her fall was stopped by the courageous intervention of one of the extras. It was simply unthinkable that any form of life could accomplish all this. The extra told the woman to hold on tightly to him. She remained worried about what was happening in the city. Meanwhile, the consciousness of that ancient human struggled to recover. His body was being brutally struck by the protagonist, his hair having grown significantly. That man's body was hurled toward a distant mountain. Almost out of strength, he tried to mend his wounds. Turning to the head of the department, he asked if he now understood the magnitude of that destructive power. But he couldn't hear the response as he saw the approach of a colossal tsunami. The protagonist now had hair as long as Goku's older brother. It was hard to imagine what kind of life form he truly was. Having been free from her restraints for some time, Violet watched the unfolding battle. The Blood Queen had never seen that form before and questioned whether this was really the zombie she knew. This was exactly what the ancient human had witnessed. This was the true form of the zombie that had destroyed everything. Knowing his opponent was now at full power, he charged at him. But the protagonist didn't even bother to move a single muscle. Blackie, watching his boss, began wondering if he had lost control. He needed to act quickly, or that human was going to lose his life. The ancient consciousness was using all its power to end the fight, apologizing for what it was about to do to the department head's body. Beyond his sheer coldness, the protagonist's facial expression was unreadable. All he did was make a small gesture with his hand. That alone was enough to completely destroy the ancient armor. Then, by clenching his fist, he increased the intensity of the attack. To the hologram man's shock, his body was completely twisted. He was launched toward Earth in a devastating impact. His armor was utterly eradicated. Even at its most powerful form, the armor was unable to subdue the zombie. Despite everything, the department head was still alive. Looking at him, the presidents grew sorrowful, believing there was no longer any hope for him. Blackie knew they couldn't be responsible for eliminating a human leader. and the protagonist was aware of that too, which was why he snapped his fingers. Immediately, the wound on the department head's chest began to heal. With the injury restored, the only remaining problem was his freefall from an almost stratospheric height. The protagonist concentrated on regeneration. Gradually, the void was being filled once again, and the presidents watched everything in stunned silence. Even the Blood Queen was impressed by that display of power. Violet was no different, equally awed. The department head regained consciousness, somehow returning to life. Looking to his side, he realized who had done it. The protagonist remained focused, doing everything possible to complete the regeneration. Finally, the head of the department understood how things were. He also understood why the ancient civilization was so determined to erase him from existence. What they felt about that zombie was most genuine fear. With that, the protagonist had concluded his participation in the battle. There was nothing else left to be done, and the presidents observed that unusual conclusion to the events. Violet immediately emerged from the ocean to meet the zombie. She appeared completely transformed, still with a mask on her face. But he had already returned to his base form, wanting to know if she had gotten used to using the power of the bloodline. She sighed deeply, saying that it was thanks to him, that everyone's home had been completely wiped from existence. If he could have ended it in a single blow, he should have done so from the start, but the zombie didn't want to scare people. Unfortunately, he ended up scaring the vampires. The Blood Queen did her best to hide. That event caused the southern continent to shift 130 kilometers, completely changing the Earth's climate and creating the deepest trench. Since they evacuated the city in time, there were almost no casualties, and the zombies were tasked with rebuilding the destroyed cities. The head of the department continued with his administrative duties. Now he finally knew why the ancient civilization wanted to destroy the zombies. It was up to him to decide what to do after witnessing all that power. The chief inspector appeared in his office at his request and was ordered to buy the highest quality eggs, because he had a visit to make the city itch. Meanwhile, in a new city, the Blood Tribe was establishing a settlement. One of them tried to hurry up the zombie worker, who was very slow. His friend wanted to know where he got the money to hire those workers, but he refused to answer. Even though they were enemies, the loan shark agreed to lend them money. He did so because the king ordered them not to fight, which would also prevent future robberies at the bank. That's why he granted a loan with abusive interest rates. Definitely, the nickname Loan Shark he received in this story was not given for nothing. Still in conversation, the young man wanted to know where the queen was. Since everything that happened, she remained very desolate. She never imagined that her enemy was even more powerful. Until now, every time she fought him, he only used a small fraction of his power. After witnessing what she did, she understood that she would never be able to reach that existence. Now everything was calm in City Itch. But amid the ruins of the ancient civilization, people were searching for valuable items. It was the mad scientists, and they seemed to have found what they were looking for. Before them was a small body that had been incinerated. Professor Jamie carefully observed his great discovery. He would not give up on achieving his goal as long as there was life in his body. The alarm clock rang in the protagonist's room. Waking up in a good mood, he gently turned off the alarm, but he still hadn't gathered the strength to get out of bed. The protagonist's name was Zombie. As he walked to the refrigerator, he acknowledged that he didn't know his age or have any memories of his human life. The only memory he had was of when he was a student and became a zombie. At first, he was as ordinary as all the others, just like those who have nothing special. But to avoid becoming a perpetual energy engine, he decided to get stronger. He stopped attacking people and started eating protein powder meals. Eventually, with much training and dedication, he became a zombie version of Saitama. His power was unprecedented. His first transformation was astonishing. His second transformation was terrifying. And in his final form, he was a walking cataclysm. Tired of fighting, he decided to help humans by solving countless problems. This led him to have his own city. The problem was that he had become too strong, causing a constant fear among humans. The doorbell to his apartment rang. He opened the door to see who was outside. Violet didn't understand how the leader of that city could be so lazy. It had already been 2 hours, and he was late. Closing the door, he said he would be ready in a few moments. This was the dawn of a new year, and they would assist the academy in continuing to grow. Several candidates were presenting themselves once again. From that moment on, the zombie would consider them for a period of prosperity. He was introduced as the new head of the academy and timidly made his way to the stage. The students shouted loudly, welcoming him. On stage, he simply observed all that obedience. Thinking that the students must be hungry, he brought eggs for them to eat. That was not exactly what they were expecting. The former chief was now just a president, and despite the provocations, he said that no one could defeat a zombie. The head of the department was sitting, calmly drinking tea. The inspector tried to approach him, saying that an emergency was underway. They asked her the reason for the urgency, and she simply said they were in serious trouble. The supreme president was calling them. That even surprised the head of the department. The head of the department took over the call from that point on. He said he was about to send his report, but the situation was urgent, and he hadn't had time for that, though he would comply with the orders he had received. The inspector wanted to know what was going on, and he said that everyone was aware of the incident involving the ancient civilization. She didn't know how that was possible since they hadn't told anyone. He reminded her that the event was so grand that it could be seen even from the other side of the earth. According to the news, a great battle took place suspected to have involved the ancient civilization. That's what the reports were saying. Moreover, the exchange meeting was about to happen. That reminded him that he wanted to know where the eggs he had ordered were. The inspector had them properly stored. He was preparing to go to City H. Since he had made the zombie the head of the academy, he figured there was no problem asking him to do that job. As soon as he rang the doorbell, he was surprised by Violet. Even more surprising was that she was dressed as a waitress. Seeing that peculiar outfit, he began making assumptions about her. The woman said it was all just a big misunderstanding. Soon, the blue-haired woman also revealed herself, creating the head of the department. Shocked by such shamelessness, he considered reporting it to his superiors. That was far too bold, even for the two of them. The blue-haired woman was terrified at the possibility. Seeing that he was leaving, they said they were only doing it to celebrate the zombie's promotion. Both were dressed that way because they had lost a game. The head of the department found it hard to believe since those outfits were truly unusual. Since he didn't believe their words, he should enter and see for himself. Inside, the protagonist seemed to be playing a card game, and the Iron President was determined to beat him this time. It looked like he had drawn a card that would lead him to victory. The atmosphere inside the zombie's apartment was festive. Even so, the head of the department was overwhelmed with embarrassment. He saw several vegetables being tossed into the air that were then sliced into many small pieces. It was the Iron Figurant who had cut them, making an elegant presentation as he arranged them on a plate. Full of joy, he was bringing the snacks to the guests. At that moment, he realized the head of the department was there. He tried to explain, saying that he was forced by the zombie to do all that. The head of the department didn't even know what to say to him. In truth, it was good that everyone was gathered because he had important news to share. Gathered there, the zombie discovered that the head of the department was not the leader of humanity. He confirmed the information, thanking the Iron Figurant for his service. There were several provinces in that region spanning thousands of kilometers. Seeing that he was about to remove his mask, everyone immediately focused on that revelation. The head of the department removed the lower part of it, stating that he was merely the leader of the province. Seeing the curiosity of his companions, he asked if something was wrong, but they looked away. Currently, the plan had only 2 continents, and because of that, only 2 countries as well, Country A and Country B. They resided in Country A. As a great scholar, he began recounting the early history of these 2 countries and the conflicts between them. The zombie wanted to know more about the exchange meeting. It was a friendly celebration involving sports, as if it were a great global military exercise held every 4 years. Hearing this, the zombie thought it made no sense at all. The last competition had been about eradicating zombies. A single member of the neighboring country had managed to exterminate 8 million. Impressive numbers for the protagonist's base form, which was not so confident. Since he had been promoted to the position of chief, he should participate as well. The zombie realized that this girl truly believed he was human. The head of the department said that it was up to them to propose the event this year, and he would never put the zombies in danger. The protagonist wanted to know more about what federalism and monarchy meant. In another part of the country, important people were aboard a plane. Those girls had been categorically summoned there. That was the headquarters of Country B, and they had images of the battle that took place on the moon. The man asked them to analyze the images as they had been received from Country A. The girl handled the photo without showing any impression. She and her twin sister did not seem impressed by it. Even so, they continued examining the photo with great attention. They realized it was related to the technology of the ancient civilization. Their intelligence suspected that Country A was in possession of that technology, which represented a strategic disadvantage for them. They would soon be receiving the president of the other country, and he asked his best subordinates to set aside their issues with their sister. He wanted them to investigate everything at the event in a very clear manner. The king had a particular opinion regarding their sister's participation in religion. If they executed their mission well, he would request a royal pardon for her. After hearing what the prime minister had to say, they agreed to follow orders. In a secret laboratory, they were preparing more of that solution capable of enhancing strength. The professor observed the experiments with great attention. Source number 1 had already received the serum. He was awaiting the results from sources 2 and 3. A technician reported that source number 3 was being prepared. Sitting in a chair was the body they had found in the streets. Referring to the professor, the technician stated that the body was already properly prepared. That was perfect, but the scientists doubted they could successfully revive a mummy that was 1,000 years old. However, in the field of biology, there was nothing the professor couldn't achieve. He ordered the process to begin immediately. The technician started operating the lever that activated the entire system. From the other side of the room, they heard a very intense scream. Even witnessing all that, the scientists still doubted their success. If they managed to resurrect such a powerful figure, it would truly be a complete miracle. Energy and serum began to flow into that dried-out body, until finally the process was complete. With great curiosity in their eyes, they waited to see the results of their actions. A faint cough could be heard, and the small scientist was extremely excited. Contrary to what he had imagined, the revived person appeared to be extremely ordinary and unremarkable. His expectations were shattered, and he thought the process had failed. He had expected to resurrect an ancient and powerful figure, but all they had was a middle-aged bald man. The scientist wasted no time in approaching the newly revived man. He wanted to know who he was and where the powerful figure had gone. The bald man said that he was indeed from the ancient civilization and wished to be spared. The scientist called him a liar since he looked nothing like the image they had. The man said he was just an engineer. He didn't know how to fight. He designed armors, and there was nothing wrong with making cool armors. Outside the lab, the professor continued observing with great interest. It seemed even he was caught off guard by this. Seeing that the professor had turned his back on him, the bald man suggested they have a conversation since they were both men of science. That piqued the professor's interest a little. The two exchanged glances briefly, as if analyzing each other. Approaching him, the professor asked what he wanted. Even though their starting points were different, they could work together. But since he had already been defeated by the zombie, the professor wasn't interested. The man said they had already analyzed the zombie's genes. The professor's method was flawed. What was truly terrifying wasn't his strength, but his ability to become indefinitely stronger. Hearing that, the professor showed more interest. For all intents and purposes, those were the two most intelligent men on Earth. The professor was a master of biology and already had the zombie's genome. Meanwhile, that man had extensive knowledge of engineering and also knew how to use the zombie's genome. That was enough for them to create a new form of life. After presenting his proposal, he wanted to know what the professor thought about it. The professor took a moment to respond, but he had no reason to refuse that suggestion. That marked the beginning of a great and promising collaboration between the two. The head of the department's proposal was not well received. No one believed he would send the zombie as the president's bodyguard. After all, that charming figure with multiple personalities could be a danger. But the head of the department had no choice. He was worried that this could be a dangerous trip. He definitely had reasons to be concerned, and soon his request was taken seriously. The matter had already been decided. The president specifically requested a bodyguard from that province. Moreover, with just a simple favor from the president, no one would ever question the zombie's identity again. However, they still couldn't reveal that he wasn't human. The entire province would have to answer to him, and the protagonist was allowed to take two trusted people with him. They wished the new chief all the best and good luck, as he would now be the representative of the province. At the top of the city hall, a certain zombie remains in timeout. Meanwhile, the protagonist is with some of his subordinates. For the mission he had received, he could take two trusted people with him. He wanted to know who was willing to accompany him. Silence filled the meeting room. Since the fiscal year closing was underway, the lone shark couldn't go with him. The others also already had their excuses prepared. The most bizarre among them wanted to accompany the boss, eager to prove that they were reliable to the humans. He was touched by the enthusiasm of both. Outside, he took them for a walk. During the trip, they unexpectedly ran into some people. The women were already waiting for the zombie, and the blue-haired woman found those dogs extremely adorable. She approached one of them to give it some affectionate pats. The grotesque dog responded that if she did that again, it would chew her up until there was nothing left. She was immediately startled by the animal's words. She never imagined a dog could talk. Violet had to explain to her that it was, in fact, a zombie. It was time for him to follow her now, as the president of the country wanted to see him. Finally, they appeared to be in another location. Other bodyguards had already arrived as well. Like all provocative extras, they assumed he would give up on the responsibility. They couldn't believe how the former chief had been replaced by some nobody like him. But what was even more bizarre was that the president had so much trust in such a small province. After all, they could easily beat that new chief with their hands tied. The protagonist made sure to demonstrate who was actually the strongest in the room. The impact was devastating. That extra had now become part of the decoration. Violet placed her hand on her forehead in disappointment. Meanwhile, the other bodyguards were also very impressed. The blue-haired woman already knew something like this would happen. In the presence of the president, he was finally received. Even so, he still felt quite shy about the situation. The president had received good recommendations about the new chief, who was supposedly the perfect bodyguard. He asked what the bodyguard would do in case of danger. The protagonist confidently stated that, as far as he was concerned, nothing was truly dangerous. Faced with such exaggerated confidence, the president said he liked what he heard. Meanwhile, someone was exploring ruins located in Country B. A woman was sitting atop a ruined structure. Her appearance was mysterious, and she seemed to be in excellent health.